And the music stops. Good morning, everyone. Welcome everyone to the 8th Annual Academic Convivium here at Middlesex Community College. What a day we have planned. If you looked ahead and you looked at the schedule of events, we have some fantastic topics that are going to be discussed and covered by our students. When we think about our students, these are community college students that are really doing incredible academic work. I couldn't be more proud to be at this college and seeing activities like these. Thank you all for coming today. I don't want to take up too much time. There's a very packed agenda. I want to thank Dr. Andy Levy for her incredible work on this. Professor Jill Flanagan, thank you for your work on this as students have been relying on you for their research. Faculty, what are we calling them? Faculty mentors, thank you. I could not think of that word, I apologize. And this kind of day does not just come together haphazardly. You know, this is an incredible amount of work by the students, by the faculty, the staff, the college, the tech teams to put this all together. And I hope that those that are out there watching this on live stream can enjoy the day. So at this point, I'll call up Dr. Levy. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to our 8th Annual Academic Convivium. I'm Dr. Andy Levy. I'm so pleased to have you joining us for MxCC's Annual Student Research Fair, whether you're here in person or you're on the live stream. Today, you're going to hear student presentations of their research projects on topics ranging from monoclonal antibodies as a treatment, to film direction, to burnout in healthcare. And I think you're going to be really impressed by what you see. These are projects that students have been working on for a very long time, and they've produced really nice work. I'm also pleased to welcome honor students and their advisor from Norwalk Community College, students of Jonathan McMenamin-Balano. So we're very happy to have you in person. This is our first academic convivium in person in 3 years. Before we jump into the presentations, I want to say a few thank yous. I want to thank Dr. Stephen Minkler for his ongoing and unending support of the Convivium, and for Kim Hogan for taking over. Thank you to Rich Lenosi, Todd Levesque, and the Center for New Media, and all of your helpers for making all the technology work for us today. The way today is going to work is this morning we will have several oral presentations. After each presentation, I'm going to open the floor up to Q&A. After the presentations, we will break for lunch and poster sessions, which are the posters are along the side of the room, and their authors will be standing there ready to answer your questions. We will have lunch in the back of the room, and then we will resume the oral presentations for the afternoon. So that's our plan. So with that, I want to introduce our first presenter. It's Jacob Goodman. This is one of 2 presentations Jacob will be giving today. And his presentation is entitled "The Function of Monoclonal Antibodies Within the Immune System, a Possible Treatment for Difficult to Cure Diseases." Jacob.
So as you heard Dr. Levy just say, my presentation is on the function of monoclonal antibodies within the immune system, a possible treatment for difficult to cure diseases. First, we have to understand what we can use monoclonal antibodies for. We have to know what they are. So monoclonal antibodies, just like normal antibodies within the immune system, are made up of a few different parts. The effector region, which is able to connect with receptors in the immune cells, connected by disulfide bonds with the antigen binding site made up of heavy and light chain parts of the protein. And monoclonal antibodies, because they are man-made, can be made up of either fully human protein or partially animal protein, which has effects for immunogenicity, which I will go into a little bit later, as it does have effects on its use. So the function within the immune system for monoclonal antibodies, or antibodies in general, is that they first detect foreign particles and foreign cells within the immune system, activate T cells, which can then start destroying the particles and the foreign cells. B cells can then create more of these antibodies, and phagocytes can have, with the help of antibodies, can help ingest and destroy these foreign cells by literally ingesting them. In short, the immune system is able to, the antibodies are able to bind to the antigens on these foreign cells and then allow the immune system to destroy them. Now, for monoclonal antibodies, we have to know how they are made. And the simple way that it is done, or a simple way of putting it, is that they are first produced using cell cultures, whether it be plant tissue, animal tissue, or human tissue, and then separated out and filtered using various methods of centrifuging, protein capture, anion exchange, many different methods used all throughout the manufacturing process. And this right here is the actual roadmap for that manufacturing method, one of the ways that it can be done. And now this seems very, very complicated, and one part you may recognize is the bioreactor, which is basically just a big tank which they use to produce the cells. The reason I'm showing this to you is because to separate and filter out those antibodies that are very helpful, we first start with something as complicated as this, which is a picture of an actual cell, well, an image created using different methods, not an actual picture, but it shows all of the different stuff that we have to filter out to go from that to just the antibody. Now, how can we use monoclonal antibodies? We can use them for different types of treatments of diseases like COVID-19, cancers, autoimmune diseases even are being looked into. And currently, it has been shown that there's a lot of efficacy in this, where it significantly decreased infection rates for COVID-19, and for different cancers, it's shown to have a positive reaction in over half of patients that have used monoclonal antibodies. And the way that it affects cancers, because it has to detect our own cells, the tumor cells, researchers actually look into figuring out different receptors within those tumor cells that are different from normal healthy cells. That way, the man-made antibodies, the monoclonal antibodies, can actually differentiate between the two and help our immune system attack them. Now, for its relationship to COVID, monoclonal antibodies are able to attach to the spike proteins on COVID. And that right there on the left side is an actual, the actual spike protein structure of COVID-19, along with 3 different areas in which types of monoclonal antibodies can attach to that protein and help then detect and destroy it within our immune system. Some of the issues that we have currently when it comes to creating and using monoclonal antibodies is, as I mentioned before, immunogenicity. What this is provoking a response within the immune system that is unwanted. Say, instead of attacking the cell that we want it to, the foreign cell, it attacks the antibody itself, which is why we try to create antibodies that are more human-like than animal-like, because that decreases the probability of that type of response. The other issue can be the cost. Right now, the production of antibodies is very difficult. As I showed before, it's very hard to separate them out from everything else within the manufacturing process. And that can create issues where it can cost between $150 or up to $12,000 for every course of treatment. Some ways that we can fix this is by changing how we manufacture them, where instead of creating it in a single batch and doing it over and over again and having to clean it out in between every single time we make some, we do it continuously, where as one part of the system is being filtered out, you can create even more cell culture, and that can shorten the process and create more antibodies for less price. We also can use different types of cells within the culture itself, which can decrease the cost. Say, instead of using animal cells, which can be more costly to produce and harder to use, we could use things like rice endosperm cells, which are the cells surrounding the embryo of a plant and contain lots of nutrients that we can use instead of helping grow the seed to grow antibodies. And the last thing we could do is utilize mRNA, which has been talked about already for COVID-19 for producing the different types of vaccines. We could also use that to actually implant within the cell the code needed to create the antibodies, which can get around the immunogenicity problem, so that even if it's made in a plant cell or an animal cell, it would still be mostly or fully human monoclonal antibodies. In conclusion, even though there are some problems right now, in the future, monoclonal antibodies will be able to solve many issues for diseases that are currently plaguing this earth.
So we'd love to field questions, but in order for those on the live stream to hear, if you could step up to the microphone with questions, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
You knew you'd be getting a question from me, so so you pointed out it's expensive and it's a lot of work to make antibodies. So why would it be preferable to use an antibody as opposed to a vaccine, or especially now since we have the mRNA technique to generate an immune response?
I guess the best answer for that is that many other drugs are able to some drugs are able to destroy certain cells, but antibodies themselves are able to utilize the immune system itself rather than going around the immune system. It actually, like monoclonal antibodies, are able to take advantage of the immune system, and once they're in our body, our immune system can also, it helps our immune system detect that disease in the future, whatever it may be.
Okay, thank you.
So what are, if any, are the downsides for the patient of monoclonal antibodies?
I guess one of the only downsides right now would be if it was, as I mentioned before, like not fully human antibodies, if it's more of like a chimeric kind of antibody, because then it could have a less favorable response and it could attack the antibody rather than the disease that they're trying to have it fight against. But that can be solved in the future.
So you mentioned that if the antibody isn't fully humanized, then the immune system could have a negative response and attack the antibodies. Now, I know a little bit about antivenom and how we take antibodies from, say, horses or whatever, injected with venom, and we take those antibodies and put it in the human. How come that works, but those antibodies you mentioned don't work sometimes?
So you mean, so you're talking about like how antivenom, like they're able to use like the blood from different animals that are able to go, like if you injected venom into like a different animal and used like their blood serum to help?
Yes, the animal produces antibodies against that venom, and then we extract the antibodies from that animal and use them on humans.
My guess, I don't know as much about antivenom as I do about the antibodies, but I think it probably might have the same issues of like a negative response, but because antivenom is so helpful against like the actual venom itself, that maybe that's like less of a worry when using it at this point in time. So it might be an issue, but like just not really as important when it comes to antivenom as it does antibodies.
Okay.
Okay, our next presenter is Venishia Nakandala. She will be describing her presentation on psychological analysis of a childhood habit.
Doe, a deer, a female deer. No, I'm not here to sing today, but I'm here to present my psychological analysis on a childhood habit that I perceived. The weirdest thing I did was singing as a child. I will be talking about the neurological perspective, the biological, as well as the behavioral perspectives today. To talk a little bit about the background, as a 3 or a 4-year-old little girl, I always used to isolate myself and sing in a corner. I used to sing when I was stressed. I used to sing after fights with my brother and sister. I used to sing when I was feeling lonely, or maybe when I wanted some attention. When you talk about singing, singing is voice, but with a tune. And just like anything, singing also, or maybe voice, needs a power supply, which is the air that we breathe, and a sound source, which is put out of your vocal cords, and the sound resonator, which is your mouth and your nose. Now, like anything else, singing is also controlled or maybe produced with the brain, support of the brain. And I must mention that the frontal cortex, the frontal lobes, is actually connected and is involved in reasoning as well as singing and production of music. Singing is also definitely involved in the larynx. The larynx is controlled by the neurons in the sensory motor cortex, and the larynx generates sound by bringing vocal folds together, and voice from the lungs is put out through the larynx. Vocal pitch, as opposed to the larynx, is controlled similarly when speaking and singing. And this area is called the dorsal laryngeal motor cortex. If I say that the brain is a studio between ears, I'm not wrong, especially because a lot of the brain is used when producing music, especially the visual cortex in relation with performance, and the hippocampus in order to produce memory with music, and the motor cortex that's involved in dancing or playing an instrument, and so on. And singing definitely has multiple uses, and singing improves brain function, the memory, stress relief, it helps manage pain, and it's also heart healthy. And you might not know that the lung capacity increases, and you might not know that it's heart healthy because you increase a lot of air when you sing, and that helps a lot of oxygen get into the blood, whereas that is almost as similar to exercising. Like I mentioned before, singing helps you relieve stress because singing also increases endorphins, oxytocin, and serotonin, and decreases the stress relief, the stress hormone, which is cortisol. When I talk about the biological perspective, singing, like anything else, is genetic or learned. Genetic because most of the functions that is needed for singing, just like the nasal cavities, the function of the lungs and the capacity of the lungs, and maybe the structure of your mouth and your lips is genetic. Whereas learning pitch, the tune, the words of a song is definitely easy to learn. And in my case, I think I got a little bit of both. I got genetics as well as learned aspects. And when you learn, many parts of the brain is involved. The auditory system, the hand-eye coordination, and the behavioral skills. When I talk about behavioral perspective, I used to sing when I was bored, or when I was lonely, or when I was sad and when I needed some attention. Why I learned to sing was because I was classically conditioned to be calmed when singing, and Singing as a child gave me a rewarding experience. So when I used to be sung to, I was also rocked to sleep. That was my classical condition. So when I used to be rocked and put to sleep while singing, I used to get the feeling of rocking whenever I was sung to. So before conditioning, the unconditioned response was the calming effect, and when I was being rocked to sleep, the unconditioned response was the calming effect. And once conditioned, I was conditioned to calming effect, and the stimulus was singing. Like I mentioned before, these are some more of the rewards that I gained by singing. The immune system boosts, the clear thinking, the benefits of the heart, as well as increased energy and improvement of the memory. Thank you.
Venishia, you mentioned that singing is both heart healthy and improves the immune system. Is the mechanism for that the reduced stress, or is there some other process at play?
Stress and a lot of air that spreads in, because oxygen is taken into your body, and that's almost as similar to exercising. Thank you.
Okay. Our next presenter is one of our guest honor students from Norwalk Community College, and her advisor joined us just in the nick of time. So Alexandra Kleinman is going to present Transferrable Properties of Reading Comprehension for Mathematics, a personal initiative approach to reading comprehension skills in mathematics applications. Alexandra, so you can advance with this.
Good morning. My name is Alexandra. Today I'd like to share my research with you on the transferable properties of reading comprehension for mathematics using a personal initiative approach. Before I start, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting us to participate. All right, so who am I and why am I interested in this in the first place? Well, I started as a student at Norwalk Community College in the fall of 2020 just because of the pandemic. And when I started, I was originally placed into pre-calculus because of my high school GPA, but that had been a while ago, and I couldn't even remember how to add fractions. So instead, I started in math for the liberal arts, which is a couple level behind that. And what happened in that class was, even though I started as someone who was not a math person and really, frankly, didn't care, I applied my skills of reading and inquiry, and I found that I liked it. I decided to stick with math, and I decided to stick with school too, and I became a peer tutor for math and for English. What I found as a tutor for English was that students really weren't reading, and a lot of the emphasis was mostly on the writing skills. And if I had applied my reading skills to get me somewhere with math, then I had an intuition that it did matter that students weren't reading. How could we expect them to read a math problem if we really weren't reading at all? So part of this is that it is obvious that you would need to use your reading comprehension skills for a math word problem. But what about a math problem that doesn't have words in it at all? Or what about just reading the textbook? So before I get into this anymore, I want to give a little bit of a disclaimer that it was difficult to put together a cohesive story because a lot of the parts of this happened simultaneously and are still ongoing. So I'm going to ask you to please, I'm inviting you to use your order of operation skills to put this together with me as we go along. So there are 3 things that I would like to address. The first is the neuroscience behind this, a little bit. The second is a project that we're currently working on to collect objective data on reading. And the third is a book club that we started at NCC to encourage students to develop their reading skills, and I'd like to share some of that success with you. So where did this all begin? It started with really an observation. So I've got math problems that I don't know how to read, and this came up in tutoring sessions a lot too. So this was common, where the student is asked to consider the words 5 less than a number, and then to convert that into symbols and numbers only. Their intuition is sometimes to write 5 minus x, because the word 5 comes first, and then the term less than a number. Except that to get to the correct symbolic representation, you would need to transpose those terms and be able to abstract the ideas before coming to that conclusion. So we're going to come back to that. Okay. I don't know about any of you, but I was doing other things this past year besides my capstone project. And I was applying to schools for transfer, and I was looking at the library of this one university, and they had these amazing primary source documents from Horace Mann, who he's the father of what we now consider modern education. And what was cool was that even though I wasn't looking for this, it happened to coincide with my research, because if this was how we were learning and this is how it had been originally structured for us, how could I reconcile those and how could I look at that? What Horace Mann thought about comprehension is that it should be this more stratified process in which the student can wrap their arms around a whole idea and be able to apply bigger ideas and bigger principles to the smaller ones. How this can apply to something like 5 less than a number is when a student can use bigger ideas or draw on their reading comprehension skills to apply to a math problem, they can come to a different type of answer that may be more helpful. The other part of this where Mann is interesting in this conversation are his ideas on taking responsibility for your education. So I'm going to ask you to consider when you took responsibility for your education and really why you did that. His ideas were that we shouldn't try to bribe students and we shouldn't try to make them afraid. And we also shouldn't try to convince them that what they're doing now will benefit them in the future. All right, so this is definitely my most exciting and colorful slide of all of them. But if you do look away and close your eyes for just a moment and think about 45 plus 24. Now open them. Where did those sounds and possibly visuals take you? Well, when you think about math, the ventral temporal cortex, is the part of your brain that enables the commissural pathways to make these associations. I'm not a neuroscientist, and it's going to take at least a couple more math classes to even start thinking about that. But I did want to get some kind of an idea of how we could understand where in the brain and how the structure of this part of your brain can make these types of associations between ideas happen. While I was doing my nonfiction reading for my capstone, I learned that it's actually fiction that can help us develop these skills of looking at ideas from different angles, developing the skill of reading between the lines, of theory of mind, to be able to read a book and say, I wonder what's going to happen next. I wonder how this character perceives this. What's going to happen next in the storyline of this book? We can apply those types of reading skills to a math problem and look at the variables and numbers and symbols in an equation or a statement and look at it in different ways first. So how can we measure reading with the tools that we do have? How can we study the changes made by reading without putting students in fMRIs, even though those colors were beautiful? We wouldn't want to be that invasive with this project, even if we did have those tools available to us. So we found a program called Solve, where students are invited to write proposals for project funding from MIT. And a couple of my classmates and I have been getting together weekly since the winter to come up with an idea of how to develop an objective tool to collect data on reading. And we've come up with many different iterations, and the one that we're working on now is a bookmark that uses motion and sound to pick up on the movement of pages. This is an ongoing process, and because of that, it's actually a beautiful thing because it leaves room for new honors students to come in and pick up on the momentum that we've already started and contribute new ideas. Simultaneously, we also started a student book club at NCC. So it's been amazing to create a space of opportunity for students to take part in their own education out of their own volition. We have read 5 books this academic year, and this is my favorite. I highly recommend it. And it's been hard to measure success because we've had students pick up books from the student activities office and then they didn't show up to the meetings. But even though the success is immeasurable, we're still trying to increase opportunities for students to join. So for year 2 of the student book club, our student book club, we are inviting English faculty to choose some of the books on our fall book list and incorporate that into their classroom curriculums. That way, students may have read some of the texts that we're reading in our book club already and be that much more inclined to join us and take that next step on their own. Okay. In summary, I'd like to leave you with 3 mathematical statements. The first one is questioning how this worked with just me. So with an N of 1, did I get better at math from reading more this year? That's hard to tell because I have a B in college algebra right now, and you can use your own rubric of success as the honors student that you are to decide what that means for you. The next part of this is also a question that I'm going to ask you is, with an N of many in a book club, how would you present the types of behaviors that you would want others to emulate? And how would you communicate this opportunity to others? How do you say that you can and should do something without actually saying it? What would your book club look like? And what would a book club look like at Middlesex Community College? The last part is with the integration of a project that we're working on like Solve, that collects objective data on reading to see progress and effectiveness. Integrating that into the book club, there can be infinite possibilities. Thank you to all the presenters and the organizers of this program. Thank you to my Solve teammates and book club members. And most importantly, I want to thank my advisor, Professor Jonathan McMenamin-Balano, for your support and guidance throughout this project.
Thank you, Alexandra. Questions? Feel free to step up to the mic if you have any questions.
Do you think that just the act of reading just exercises your mind and helps bring you to like a place where your mind can function better to do math? Do you think that's an aspect of making your math better?
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a great question. Yesterday, my professor and I were trying to consider how we would put all of these parts into an equation. And if we were to look at this like PEMDAS, the order of operations, I see reading as the exponent that raises all types of learning to the next power. So yes, I do think that reading just helps overall.
Thank you. Other questions? I'm wondering, first of all, I love the multifaceted, multi-pronged approach that you've taken to this idea. I'm curious how your math professors have responded to your thinking and your approach and your focus on reading regarding math.
I wonder also. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I actually did get a chance to present this to my algebra professor, and that was a cool experience to get his feedback. But yeah, I don't know. I think I just bother them with a lot of questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think you're bothered, but Venishia, you want to step up to the mic?
Oh, okay, just a regular question. Have you met anyone who don't read but are really good at math? You have.
Yeah. I mean, all of this is possible, but imagine what it would be like for them to read. I wonder, taking that kind of perspective, but that's a great question.
Thank you. Any other questions for Alexandra? All right, thank you so much. Okay, our next presenter is also from Norwalk Community College. It's Matthew Coe, and he will be speaking about platypus genes and food recipes.
Hi, I'm Matt. Thank you for, first off, inviting me. Thank you for having me here. And yeah, so what do platypus genes and food recipes have in common? One is an actual Frankenstein creation that I have no idea how to comprehend. And the other one's a platypus. So yeah, I got into cooking recently, and creme brulee, I don't know. But yeah, so more seriously, both of these are data sets, specifically the genes and the ingredients that can be tagged into a database for easier access. Right, so this is my capstone project, and I'll be presenting on what I found during my research on the Neuregulin gene for Ornithorhynchus anatius, or the platypus. Yeah, so what is Neuregulin? What does it do? Neuregulins actually serve multiple roles in the embryonic development of vertebrates, right? So in humans specifically, it actually serves multiple functions, one being that it helps differentiate the Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes in a human being, one being in the central nervous system and the other being in the peripheral nervous system. It also has some role in cardiac development because people realized if you remove it from, say, fly, Drosophila, they just die. So yeah, it's pretty important there as well. And also the Neuregulin 1 gene specifically can potentially have something to do with schizophrenia, which is also interesting. So basically Neuregulin, NRG for short, there's a whole bunch of nerve-related things in the body. So yeah, for all intents and purposes, all you need to know is that little box right there. That's Neuregulin, right? So the outside, it consists of three parts. The outside being the extracellular domain, right, which is above the phospholipid bilayer, and everything inside, so like the red little spot right there, that is the transmembrane domain, and the intracellular domain, which is very conveniently, just not existing, nobody really knows much about, which is also inside the cell. So yeah, everything that is currently known about neuregulins is based off of the extracellular and transmembrane domain. And yeah, so what I've been doing is I've been trying to, I've been trying to uncover possible mechanisms behind the intracellular domain of a protein called energy. So to preface, our work has only been possible because of this amazing revolutionary breakthrough in protein imaging technology. It was in July of last year when DeepMind published an AI program called AlphaFold 2. And on the same day, Washington University had also published their own program called Rosetta Fold on the same day of DeepMind's. And they were both published as open source software. This was crazy, for lack of a better word. These programs are open source, so they're free to the general public to use. So we went on from having no good way to estimate protein shapes to two different ways overnight. So before now, it was incredibly difficult to figure out what proteins looked like. And what a protein looks like is essentially how it functions. So this is incredibly important. Now, everything had to be calculated by hand. So to put this into perspective, calculating the shape of a single protein could take up to years with multiple teams from around the world. So now just anybody, because the software is free, with a click of a button, could just get an equally valid estimate of the structure of a protein. Anybody, that's ridiculous. So yeah, overnight. So anyways, here's what my research team has been doing. So as you see here, the octopus, flatworm, platypus, and the bonobo chimp. These are what we've been working on. These are the organisms in particular. And if Neuregulin is critical to nerve development in vertebrates, then all vertebrates should have some form of it, right? And if they don't, then, neuregulins will have to use some sort of, or organisms will have to use some sort of substitute to maintain the vertebrates the vertebral structure that is formed. So yeah, this is where phylogenetics comes in, or evolutionary trees. We actually decided to use hypothetical phylogenies to see how neuregulins could have possibly changed or evolved to fit a vertebrate's needs over time. Cool, so now to compare the platypus's neuregulin, platypuses, platypi, platypodes, they all work. Now to compare the platypus's neuregulin to that of other organisms, we used conserved domains within the neuregulin sequences and increased and decreased stringencies in the algorithm in NCBI, the database that we used, to find similar proteins with similar structures to that of the proteins in our platypus. So I don't know if you can see, but I actually reduced the stringency levels in NCBI's algorithm to allow for more variation in returned sequences. So as you go down the list, the percent accuracy, so like percent identifiable goes from 100 and it just goes down, right? But see, what's important that these are still acceptable results. So, you know, like creme brulee, right? Did you guys know you can substitute heavy cream for half and half in butter? That's actually the exact same concept, right? We're reducing stringency levels in what is acceptable, right? We're allowing for the use of half and half and butter in place of heavy cream, right? So over here, right, what would an organism use in place of Neuregulin? That's what we're trying to find out. Yeah, whatever. Next. Yeah, so this is the key concept to what we've built by changing stringencies. Anyways, this is a program that I've sort of jury-rigged. I have a background in computer science and engineering and data scraping, and so I jury-rigged a data scraper to fit my recipe analogy. So I had mentioned earlier, NCBI was the database that we found all of our genetic sequences, right? So they work with other companies around the world to maintain a genetic library that we continue to use to this day, and it's quite great. All I have to do here, actually. So see, this I had compiled a list of recipes off of Blue Apron and added my own little recipe over there. And if you see, like that's all of the recipes I had added, right? If you only specifically ask or request a pull for recipes that only have meat, then you will only get in this program things that have meat. And then if you further add another tag that asks for the ingredient or the recipes that only use meat and yellow curry paste, then there you go. Those are pretty great. So anyways, yeah, all I would have to do to fit this analogy to the platypus genetics is all I just have to do is pull the metadata from NCBI instead of Blue Apron, say, and then I'd be able to sort genetic sequences in the same exact way as I did for recipes. Oh, also, stringency levels would further be enhanced with the open source software that is provided with DeepMind and the University of Washington, which I also mentioned previously. So yeah, in our current silico analysis, we've compiled our data sets, and each file essentially looks like this. As of now, it's comprised of a list of blast searches for every relevant extracellular isoform that's searched across 3 different stringency levels. Yeah, so this has been done with octopus and bonobo with relation to humans, and yeah, human Neuregulin for comparison. And yeah, our next steps would ideally be to load this information, this data set, into the program that I had jury-rigged previously. And then it would be ready to, say, interface with DeepMind's AlphaFold AI, which was also mentioned. And this would come up with possible protein structure comparisons. Yeah, so this combination of ideas would not only provide new insights within individual blast search comparisons, like the one you see here, but it could also make searching for genetic sequences more intuitive, just generally speaking, since the layperson can just, with a click of a button, yeah, and it would be more accessible to anybody who wants to try to use DeepMind's algorithms or the UWash's algorithms. And this actually genuinely is revolutionary discovery and breakthrough in protein imaging. So that concludes my capstone presentation. I would like to thank Kezia and Mahmoud, who were my research partners, and for this project, and also Professor McMenamin-Balano, who somehow got us all into a room every week or so for a year. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Questions? Do you want to step up because the live stream can only hear with the microphone? Thank you.
So Matt, I'm going to find out if you were paying attention or not because I was stuck in traffic. So earlier there was a talk about monoclonal antibodies, right? right? And presumably they were going to discuss how it is, their specificity for distinct epitopes that we tagged so they could be destroyed using that sort of chemical approach. How would OpenMind actually make that more efficient, or DeepMind make that more efficient? And how would you see it fitting into the question you were actually asking here?
So essentially what I would think is we could bypass that, couldn't we? Since the AI for DeepMind, we would interface by using the structures that we pull from DeepMind's algorithms, right? So by doing that, all the AI will have to do is compare the structures themselves and try and figure out any relationships or similarities, visually speaking. So yeah, I think we wouldn't actually have to run into that issue, especially in silico, since all it's doing is comparing visual images to try and find relationships between protein structures, I guess. Yeah, great question.
Other questions from Matt? Yes, Jacob.
So before, if I remember at the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned that the intracellular part of the
Neuregulin?
protein was not really known. Would you be able to use this computer programming to look into the genetic sequence to figure out like what part of the protein that is, and then use that to also figure out the structure of it?
Exactly. So that's exactly it. So what actually is going on is we know the genetic sequence, like we know how it codes, but we don't know what it looks like or also what it does because it's within the cell and nobody's bothered to, or no. People have looked at it, but So yeah, we will be using, or the plan is to use AI to try and estimate the physical structures of the intracellular domain, and then use those images and compare them with other ones to see if we can find relationships that we can then match into the phylogenetic tree that we had mentioned earlier.
I see. I thought you were in the presentation. I thought you were talking about like comparing the outer portion of it. So.
Great question.
Other questions for Matt? I love your excitement and enthusiasm about this. Do you plan to continue this work?
No, I'm done.
You're done.
No, that was a joke. That was a joke. Yeah, I'm stuck with him.
You're stuck with him. I think you're in pretty good shape with him. But yeah, I love your enthusiasm. I'm glad you're going to continue it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, our next presenter will look familiar. We have Jacob Goodman presenting on the psychological basis of fidgeting. Jacob.
Yes, so this presentation of mine for my psychology class is on the psychological basis of fidgeting and like how that can affect people. So to first start, I want to go into some past experiences for fidgeting. For me, that I was always like nervous as a kid, and I would always kind of like move my hands around and sort of like bend them. And as a kid, I also realized I was able to bend my fingers and my hands more than the usual person, and able to almost use it as a bit of a party trick. Like normal people wouldn't be able to bend their fingers backwards, but I could. I'd use that to freak people out sometimes. And going into that, that is one of the biological factors of fidgeting, which is hypermobility, that ability to bend joints at greater than normal angles. This can happen due to like lack of connective tissue, and it could be like just a normal thing or due to other causes. Some of those causes could just be normal, it could be benign, or it could be due to something called Alfred-Danilov syndrome, which I do not have, but others do, which is that hereditary and genetic lack of enough connective tissue, which leaves people with more flexibility, but also many other issues. And it can be associated with like more restless behavior and fidgeting and kind of like unable to just like stay in one place. So some other factors when it comes to fidgeting can be increased amounts of stress as well as anxiety, mainly things like social anxiety. So for stressful environments, there have been studies looked into the types of stress that can affect children and their movements, such as stress within the home, parent-related stress and anxiety. And a study done by Andrea Fields and others has shown that stress expressed by parents at home has actually had a considerable increase in the amount of anxiety and stress within the children that have noticed it and see it. They actually do have a legitimate impact. And some different signs of stress can be muscle tension, restlessness, fatigue, and some difficulty concentrating. And to go back on that, for the restlessness, all of this stress can actually lead back into fidgeting and moving around. So going into anxiety, and specifically social anxiety, a research study by Thompson tested people on their speech and interaction with others. They had strangers sit down with one another and talk for a period of time and measure their amounts of movements and signs of anxiety and stress while they were in this kind of anxious position. And they did find that people moved around a lot more and actually fidgeted more during these types of interactions, although it did not actually impact their ability to speak and their level of speech with other people. Some results of the study have shown, as I just said, the increase in fidgeting and trembling, but no changes in the verbal fluency or expression. Just like now, I'm moving my hands a lot, but I'm not unable to talk. I'm not stuttering as like more than my usual amount, I guess. And some more of these links between anxiety and hypermobility have been found on a more deeper genetic level, in that for hypermobility itself, there's been findings with an increase in the duplication of chromosome 15, dup 25. There's like a connection between like hypermobility and anxiety, and as well as hypermobility has been found to increase the amount of environmental and like just pain perception in general, which can make people want to move around a bit more, and has also, because of that, increased the amount of anxiety. You're more afraid to get hurt, I guess. Some more of the neurological factors of fidgeting have to do with the cerebellum, which is kind of the primordial brain in a way, and the motor cortex, which is for more fine movement. So for the cerebellum, it's more about the like unconscious movements, like maintaining balance, being able to stand up, just walking around. You don't really think about walking around, and more like fine movements. So like if you're unconsciously fidgeting, this is the part of the brain where it would usually happen. And then going into the motor cortex, This is more about really thinking about your movements, like directly reaching out to grab something. And the reason this is important is because the motor cortex is also part of the frontal lobe, which is directly connected with, along with the motor cortex, more emotions and memory. So if you're thinking about something bad that happened in the past, or you're getting emotional, that can have a more direct effect on the motor cortex and how you move. And to conclude, all of these things together between the stress, between biological factors like the hypermobility and more of these neurological factors, all of them can lead to increases in fidgeting and anxiety.
Thank you, Jacob. Questions for Jacob?
Sorry, Jacob. I'm curious.
Mhm.
You didn't mention the basal ganglia at all, and I'm wondering if when you were doing your research, what you discovered in terms of if we have intentional and unintentional movement and that perception of pain and maybe the fear of the pain itself, at what point in time was the signaling between the motor cortex and the frontal cortex sort of like routed through how you're going to respond to the anticipation of fear, and or is it okay to experience the fear? Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah. I during my research, I didn't look into like the connection between the motor cortex and the cerebrum. But I would definitely have to do that in the future because if they were both connected, then we would have to see like what parts of the brain, and including the basal ganglia, as you said, like might have an impact on. So yes.
Other questions for Jacob? I have a question. So, right, it's very clear that there's this connection between anxiety and fidgeting, and in a given individual that manifests in different ways, right? But do you have an understanding based on your research of the why? Why does anxiety cause fidgeting?
Along with the parts of the brain, I guess part of the reason why it might increase in fidgeting is the movement might have like a positive relaxation kind of effect, where the physical movement might redirect your thoughts towards like your movements rather than whatever unhappy thing is happening at the moment, whatever thing is causing the anxiety.
Yeah, right. I mean, it would be speculation, which
Yeah.
I think that's a very reasonable theory.
Mhm.
Other questions for Jacob? Okay, thank you so much. Jalen, do you have slides? Come on up. Your MxCC? Yeah. Okay, so our next presenter is Jalen Ingram, and he will be presenting on antisocial personality disorder. So you can either use the keyboard to advance or these arrows.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, hi all. My name's Jalen Ingram. I'm representing for the psychology class here at Middlesex, and I'm presenting for antisocial personality disorder, and I hope you learn a lot about it. So what is ASPD, or antisocial personality disorder? In shorter terms, to characterize, for the most part, it's characterized by a lack of social irresponsibility. So in other words, just like, you and I, we have a responsibility towards one another to, be kind to one another, say please and thank you, and, treat each other kindly. That's what we call a social responsibility towards one another. One who is characterized as a socially antisocial person will not feel inclined to do so. It is a pattern also of manipulating others and exploiting, and the individual has no regard for right or wrong. So more on it, it affects 3.6% of the US population, almost 8 million Americans in the US. It actually represents 80% of the prison population, which is interesting enough. And again, it's represented by that pattern of disregard, that sense of right and wrong is not present in this individual. So that is important to note. And it is actually directly correlated with sociopathy. And actually, I'll show you right here, if possible. If you look it up in the Google search or any browser that you have available, I'll show it to you right here, the direct correlation. When you search up sociopathy, you actually get antisocial personality disorder. So you see that direct correlation between sociopathy and antisocial personality disorder. It's right there. I felt that was a very interesting correlation between the two. So, awesome. More on it, some symptoms on it. We have repeated lying. So again, that lack of social responsibility that the individual will have towards another person, lying, manipulation, and it's also characterized by fights and job issues. And these are things that the person will have, this individual will have towards another person. Again, that lack of social responsibility. So yeah, this is the basis of antisociality. And you think of the word antisocial, this was me at first, this isn't what I really think of when I hear the word antisocial. This isn't what I think was really characterized. Very criminal behavior is what I see when I did more research on it. And so I decided to look more into it. So there is a difference between that antisocial personality and the one that we are generally more common with. Asociality is what we'll see. So with antisociality, it's defined by, again, a lack of disregard for another's personal space, that social responsibility. Again, asociality is defined by a lack of motivation to engage with others or to be kept to themselves. And I feel like that's more of the definition that we have been associated with in terms of antisociality. So again, antisociality is represented by an aggressiveness, while asociality, not so much. And again, they prefer to stay in their own space, while antisocial individuals will go out of their way to manipulate and exploit. And again, it is interesting to note that an antisocial individual can be seen as introverted. They can be. They can also be extroverted as well, while asocial individuals are usually to themselves, and they have that introverted personality to them. So, I get invited to a party by my friends, and, and I don't feel too up to, talk to people. And, I feel like I'm going to keep to myself. I'm going to be antisocial at this party. That's what I say to myself. What I really mean is, I'm going to be more asocial. I'm going to be to myself, because there's a difference between the two. And I thought that was interesting to find out in my research. So some more behaviors and thoughts characterized by antisociality. I have a video here. I'm not going to play it for sake of time, but I thought it was interesting how the doctor brought up these situations and these scenarios in which an antisocial individual will react. For example, an antisocial individual gets into a car accident, right? It's their fault. They think to themselves, oh, this isn't my fault. That person should have given me the right of way. It was my turn to go. Or an individual is caught smoking in a restaurant and they're thrown out. And this individual thinks to themselves, oh, I have the right to smoke if I want to. I should be able to smoke if I want to. No one should throw me out for smoking. That's my right. Again, that lack of social responsibility, that inability to distinguish between right and wrong is what the person is unable to do. These high energy situations, it feels good to them. The exploitation of other people, the lack of remorse. So these are the thoughts. These are the kinds of behaviors that you'll see in an antisocial individual. What are some causes and influences that contribute to antisociality? Genes, of course, are a factor. And again, neurologically, in birth and pregnancy is also a factor as well. And developmental factors such as child abuse, sexual abuse, are factors that contribute to antisociality. So a lot of what contributes to antisociality begins in the developmental stages of an individual and into adulthood. And again, a smaller or damaged amygdala, which in the brain contributes to emotions in a person, is what contributes to antisociality. So more on the amygdala, again, a contributor in antisociality. Adult rhesus monkeys, a study was shown in 2015 that when there were lesions brought to the brain to manually damage the amygdala of these monkeys, it showed these signs of antisociality. So you see that these monkeys that were paired with a mate at first, now with their damaged amygdalas, are not able to communicate with their mates as they were before. They're not grooming their mates like they naturally should be doing. They're not associating with other individuals as they should. So that is another sign of the change that these changes that were able to surface. And these social impairments could be directly correlated with antisociality. So I thought that was a good contribution to the research, for sure. A more clinical perspective on antisociality given by some psychologists, an abstract that was found online, they found more, it contributes to more of an ineffective parenting practices. So again, during that developmental stage, it contributes a lot to their what's going to happen in their adult life. And academic failure, peer rejection, a depressive mood, and involvement in deviant peer activities contributes to this attitude that surfaces more into adulthood. And this chronic delinquent behavior does contribute to this antisocial personality that develops later. So what are some treatment options that go into antisocial personality disorder, ASPD? There is no cure for mood disorders or personality disorders, which is unfortunate. But to treat it, there are some anti-anxiety drugs that can be taken, and as well as mood stabilizers that will lessen the effects of these personality disorders. And that goes for a lot of mood disorders and personality disorders. From what I found, these no cure really, but really treatments that can help to lessen the effects and these contributors to the disorders. So very helpful. Therapy is also an option, psychotherapy, behavioral therapy, as well as family counseling is a great help. So being able to do it with your family, people that you love by your side, especially with people that aren't, they're not able to associate like normal people would, to be able to do it with your family, with people that you love side by side, is a great help and a contributor to getting better. So I wanted to ask some questions, and if you guys think you have the answer in mind, feel free to raise your hand. I'll call on you. So the first question I have for you is, blank is a factor in antisocial personality disorder? And if you think you got it, yes, please. D. All right, thank you. We'll see if you're right at the end. And again, next question. Antisocial personality disorder is not defined by blank. Yes, sir. B. The lack of motivation to engage in social interaction. All righty. Thank you very much. And our final question, which of these is an individual diagnosed with ASPD? You take your time reading those, I know. There's a lot on the board there. Just let me know when you have the answer. Anyone? Yes, sir. Very good. Thank you very much. Yeah, you guys got them right for all of them. Again, number one, D, all of the above antisocial personality disorder individuals show all of those factors. For the second, yes, a lack of motivation to engage in social interaction. And again, the last one, definitely the first one, you see that person, again, that lack of social responsibility towards one another and a disregard for right and wrong. So that is apparent in all of them. So thank you for your answers. Appreciate it. So in conclusion, yes, we can see that, this disorder, it affects children into their adulthood due to environmental factors, many factors, a lot of which they have no control over. It's unfair. And it's as unfortunate as it is, it affects people in a way that essentially hardwires their brains to do bad things. It inclines them to do wrong. And while there is no treatment or cure, there are antidepressants, as stated, antipsychotics that can be taken to weaken those erratic moods. And again, there's also therapy. And it's always an awesome idea to consult with a professional, and it's best to confront these things as soon as possible so that people can educate themselves on these symptoms and the mental influences so that they can look out for them and they're not able to potentially hurt someone that they love or themselves in the future. So there we go. Those are my citations, my references. You can talk to me afterwards if you're interested. I'll be happy to share them with you. But that's all from me.
Thank you, Jalen. Questions? Alexandra.
Hey, Jalen.
Hi.
That was incredibly informative, especially the part about antisocial versus asocial.
Mhm.
And I was so compelled by all of this, but I'm just wondering what compelled you to begin your research and like how that all began.
Well, what compelled me was, this contributed to almost 50% of my grade for my class. That's one thing I can think of. But I did think it was, like you said, very informative in my case, especially that part. Doing further research into that realm of antisociality. There's a distinguishment between what people think it actually is and what it actually is. So again, being able to educate everybody, educate myself, do further research, learn more has been a great experience. So yeah, I thank you for asking.
Great. Other questions? Jacob?
I'm curious to know two things. For the measure of like right and wrong, do you know how that is measured? Because when you mentioned that there's like a higher percentage in like prison systems, I'm curious because my guess is that like prisoners might have a much different sense of that just because of like the institution, like maybe a different type of like cause that might influence them, as well as antisocial personality disorder seems to have a lot of overlaps with narcissism. So I was wondering if you could explain like the differences between that and how they differentiate.
Between narcissism and antisociality.
Yeah, especially with that like sense of like, oh, I'm not doing wrong. It's somebody else's problem, kind of.
Right, which is characterized by that narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I feel that I think another person in my class actually did a presentation on narcissistic personality disorder, and there is that correlation between the two, the antisociality and the narcissism, that heightened sense of, I can do no wrong. What I'm doing is right, essentially, when it's really not. Again, it's that social irresponsibility that is linked to that antisociality, that the person is not able to have a normal regard for right and wrong. And I feel that that is, pretty correlated to narcissism, not having that ability to, that humility to come down to earth, come to reality that, there is a norm that we should be able to have as human beings. So yeah, there is that correlation between narcissism and antisociality. I do see it, and I thank you for bringing it up. That's nice.
Thank you.
Jacob, was the first part of your question addressed?
I don't think so. It was basically just wondering if you think at least the higher percentage could be due to their environment rather than the type of people, since a lot of that seems to have to do with that right and wrong kind of thing, which can definitely be affected if somebody isn't.
Right. I do. And again, there is that physical, neurological contributor of smaller damaged amygdalas that are linked to that kind of personality. Those that lack of remorse and that being able to associate right and wrong between human beings. I do feel that that's the case. But again, that environmental stage, that developmental stage in the beginning, I feel is key in how an individual is going to turn out in, how they are as adults when they're fully developed, because, how you do in the beginning is, a very, very, very important. So yeah, I do feel that's the case. No, of course. Thank you for asking.
Thank you, Jacob. Christian, did you have a question?
Do you think that sorry,
Of course.
do you think that APD is can be developed at later stages in life due to weakening brain function, with the coming of increased age and weakening brain function?
Mm-hmm. So I did find in my research that the main age in which the factors surface in the personality disorder is 15, actually. I should have done more research into why that was the case, but my theory is that, that is a time, it's a very pivotal time in a person's life, school, finding who you are, and, engaging with people, kids, friends, and again, kids, they do a lot of things, and they're trying to find themselves in that time of their lives. And I feel that that child stage, that developmental stage, is a huge factor. That teenage factor is important as well. So yeah, I do feel that is the case. Thank you.
I have a question for you. You mentioned a number of therapies that are available for patients with this disorder. I'm wondering how often people with this disorder actually show up at a therapy office, right? So like someone with depression, they're feeling it. They're feeling distress. They might go to a therapist because they don't want to feel distressed anymore, right? Same with someone with anxiety, but with someone with antisocial personality disorder, it's not clear to me that they will perceive a problem that they would therefore seek out a solution for.
Right. No, I do feel that's the case, because, they do feel that, what they are doing is right, and most that they do. So to go to therapy and have themselves told that, you need to change, you need to adapt to, the norms of life, essentially. Yeah, I can see that. They probably think to themselves, I'm fine, I'm good, I'm all right as I am. So yeah, that is interesting. That probably is the case but again, family counseling, that is one form of therapy that is key, because their family members probably do want for them to get better and for them to be able to socialize normally. So.
Right, it certainly affects their relationship. So perhaps the family members in distress is what gets them into therapy.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Any other questions? Yes, Jonathan.
So, the people where they're part of the antisocial social club, do we need to change that?
The antisocial social club. Yeah, the asocial social club. Yes. Yes. Maybe they are. Yeah.
Club.
Right. Well.
Excellent. Any other questions for Jalen?
Is this antisocial personality disorder always associated with damage to the amygdala? Or is it just one of the things that happens?
Good question. The amygdala is a factor in the surfacing of the disorder. In my research, I found that they don't always have to be damaged, actually. They can be smaller. They can be different in those regards.
So basically what happens as a child is that it just becomes underdeveloped with like damage and trauma is what you're saying?
Right, for the most part. And again, that is a factor. The developmental stage is definitely a big contributor in the surfacing of that attitude, of that disorder, for sure. But yeah, thank you for your question.
Chino?
So there's been debate between researchers where they say that psychopathy and ASPD have like similar, or they're basically the similar condition, but some of them are also saying that they're completely different. In your opinion, what side, I guess, would you say would you go with? It being the same exact condition or completely different?
How would you define psychopathy?
So psychopathy, back in my criminology class, it would basically have like the same definition: lack of remorse, lack of like feelings, and like lack of like thinking they're like always right. And the same thing you could say about ASPD.
Mm-hmm.
In your opinion, and obviously it's not right or wrong, what would you say it's like very similar, or there are like some differences between like psychopathy and ASPD?
Right. I don't know the exact, I would have to do some more research on, psychopathy to really say for certain whether that would be the case. But the way you describe it there, that lack of remorse, that lack of right and wrong, the inability to distinguish between the two. Yeah, it does sound a lot like ASPD. And yeah, I feel that they could be similar and, some differences in between. And I feel like that's the case with a lot of personality disorders, like narcissism, as mentioned before. Similar in some regards, but also different in many. So,
Thank you.
again, thank you for the question.
Okay, I think we've exhausted all the questions for you. Thank you so much, Jalen.
Oh, thank you all. Appreciate it. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, our last presenter before lunch is Julie Orenstein, and her presentation is entitled Directing Films. Oh, okay.
So I did my presentation. I studied directing films. Okay, so 1 second. Okay, so to start, just for people who don't know, the director on a film set is the main person in charge of making all of the creative decisions. They make the final decisions about the look of the film, the color, the framing, lighting, blocking, wardrobe, prop, production design, pretty much everything to do with the production. They also are involved with the film from the very start all the way through to the end of post-production. Sometimes they're not involved with writing the script. Sometimes they'll be given the script. Sometimes directors will write their own scripts, but they'll usually come onto the production during pre-production and then work on it all the way through post. And their main goal, essentially, is to shepherd the story that they're telling and to tell it as clearly and authentically as possible through the medium of film. So in pre-production, the director will often possibly pitch the film if they might have to do that to a studio to get funding. It depends on the film, but they're also in charge of hiring the other people that work on the production. They'll be the person that hires the department heads, such as the cinematographer, and they're also will have the final say in terms of casting the film. During pre-production, the director will analyze and read and analyze the script. They'll also work with the actors. It's common to hold table reads or rehearsals, and Throughout that process, they might also edit the script to change it more towards like if an actor is playing a character a certain way that's different from how it was written, they might change the role a bit to make it more in line with what that actor wants to do with the role. Throughout the pre-production, they'll also develop the look of the film, and they can do this through a variety of methods. Some of the most common ones are storyboarding, creating vision boards, making shot lists, or doing test shoots. The director throughout pre-production will also do a script breakdown, which details the locations, cast members, if there are extras, what props are needed, wardrobe, any special effects or stunts that are happening in each scene. And then the director will also work with every different department, such as the cinematographer, production designer, costume designer, location scout, special effects, stunt team, composer, visual effects editor, and pretty much everyone to develop a specific look and tone for that film. They'll also work with producers and location scouts to secure the locations that they're gonna shoot the film at. And it's also their job to answer any questions that anybody in the production has about the film, and to develop a shooting schedule and share it with everyone in the production. Okay, so during production, at the start of each day, it's common that the director will talk with the actors. This is because most films are not shot in order. For various reasons, it makes more sense to shoot films out of order. So they might want to talk with their actors about what part of the film they're filming that day, and where that part of the film lies in the emotional arc of the full story. They'll also want to talk with the cinematographer and other department heads to check that they are prepared to shoot that day, what they discussed they were going to film, and in pre-production. They might also view the footage that they shot the previous day. They might also talk with the producer and talk about how things are going, especially in regard to the budget. And the directors also, it depends on the director's preference, but sometimes it's common for them to work from what's called Video Village, which is basically a place of monitors where they can watch what's being filmed. And so, yeah, so they'll probably go there and make sure that that's all set up properly. So then during production, to prepare for a take, they'll first hold a blocking rehearsal with the actors to specify like what the shot will be and what the blocking of the shot will be, etc. And then the actors will break, the director will go off, and the gaffer, scripts, and lighting team, they'll all go in, light the scene, and then after that, they'll come back and do a rehearsal with cameras, and then after that, they'll usually start doing takes. And during takes, it's the director's job to pay attention to the performances and make sure that the actors are giving them what they need as far as the performance goes for the full film. And they might also give direction between the takes to the actors to get that performance more in line with what they need. Okay. So during production, once the director gets happy with the footage they've gotten, it's their job to signal to the production to move on to the next shot, and then that process will repeat until it's the end of the day. And if a major problem arises on set, it's also the director's job to work with the other people involved to find a solution to that problem. So then, in post-production, it's the director's job to just sort of guide the edit of the film. And so they'll just give notes on the final edit, the visual effects, color grade, the score, sound design, and the sound mix. And during the post-production process, this is when they might also decide to do reshoots if they feel that's necessary. So yeah, and every production is really different. So it has different needs as far as pre-production, production, and post-production go. But this is just a vague outline of the general responsibilities of director. So I decided to more specifically study 3 directors. The first director I chose to look at was David Fincher, who has directed films such as Seven, Fight Club, The Social Network, and others. So yeah. So he's known for making psychological thrillers. In his films, he usually uses yellows, dark greens, and dark blues. He's also commonly uses very contrasting lighting and will often leave his characters' faces in darkness. When he does use camera movement, he usually prefers to have that movement be very steady. He doesn't like the feeling of having a person behind the camera, and he feels like having the camera move be very smooth makes it so that the film almost feels like omnipotent, like yeah, like it feels like what is happening was doomed to happen. He also will often try to match his camera movement with the movement of his actors. So whenever an actor is moving, he'll move the camera, and the second that they'll stop, so he basically tries to sync the camera movement with the movement of the actors. Okay, Fincher also mostly shoots wide angles, and he chooses the moments when he cuts to a close-up very carefully. He often cuts to a close-up to punctuate a line of dialogue or to show what's important in the scene. He also uses a lot of CGI, but he uses it in a way that's very visible. He uses CGI to extend environments, to add like more weather, like more snow or more rain to a scene. He'll also use CGI to link shots to create impossible long takes, which is something that he did in Fight Club. And he also uses digital blood so that he can have more control over it. He also uses weather such as rain, snow, and heat as a way to set the tone for a scene. Okay, so David Fincher, he tries to take everything that he can, take everything into account that can go wrong. He also has one of the highest like shooting ratios of footage shot to compared to how much footage actually is in the film. He likes to do a very high number of takes, doing on an average of between like 20 and 60 takes per shot, but he's been known to go up to 100 takes and sometimes even past that. He believes that doing many takes gets the actors past the point of where they're trying to give a performance, and instead they just become the character. It also allows the actors to try different things with their performance, and it takes the pressure off of each individual take so that the actors are free to experiment more. He also will not move on until he's gotten footage that he feels confident in from each angle that he wanted to get it from. That way, he doesn't have to cut the scene around the actor's performance, but instead can cut the scene exactly how he wants to cut it, regardless of which shot he wants to use and when. Okay. Fincher also focuses on everything in the frame, not just the actor's performance. He wants to know as much as possible about each different role on set. This way, he doesn't have to be victimized by other people's laziness. He takes his time selecting the films that he directs and selects them very carefully because it takes him like 2 years to make a film. So if he's not connected to it, he doesn't want to do it. When he's talking with the crew, he talks, or the other people working on the production, he talks more about the story, character, and the feeling he wants to evoke rather than any of the technical aspects of that crew member's position. When editing, he will also manipulate the timing of individual events within a frame. Sorry. He'll often do this so that he can adjust the timing of an actor's performance if there are 2 or more actors in the frame. And as I said, he also uses CGI to add weather or digital blood because it gives him a mass amount of control over how that weather looks and how the blood looks. And it also, using digital blood, makes it so that he doesn't have to clean up the set after each take and instead can just keep doing take after take. And yeah. So the next director I looked at is Wes Anderson, who has directed films such as The Royal Tenenbaums, Grand Budapest Hotel, and Moonrise Kingdom. Anderson films are often shrouded in layers of artificial authorial framing that seem to point back to a creator. For example, in the Grand Budapest Hotel is a story within a story within a story. Moonrise Kingdom has a narrator that speaks directly to the camera. The Royal Tenenbaum is presented as a book. Rushmore is presented with theater curtains. The Life Aquatic has a film within a film. And he also often uses voiceover narration in his films also, as is observed in the Grand Budapest Hotel. Anderson also has a very specific style of how his films look. He uses a lot of symmetry, long lateral tracking shots, flat lays, slow motion, wet pans, planimetric compositions, and compass point editing. Planimetric compositions are when he positions the camera perpendicular to a wall or a backdrop so that the composition ends up looking very flat. And then compass point editing is a form of editing where you really only either cut between in 90 degrees or like 180-degree increments. And the compass point editing is just sort of a way so that he can maintain planimetric compositions in his film. In his films, characters also often move through flat planes within the scene. So instead of moving towards and away from the camera, they'll just move like left to right. And he also will include slightly shaky imperfections in his camera movements in the final film. He also includes many walk and talks where characters will walk and talk as their, and then his films also often feature vibrant color palettes. And in his films, characters and locations will often be strongly associated with certain colors, like the hotel in the Grand Budapest Hotel has a color scheme of being very pink and purple and red sometimes. Anderson films also feature unrealistic dialogue. The characters in his films often say exactly what they're thinking or feeling, but the dialogue is also delivered with hardly any emotion. Anderson uses this unrealistic dialogue to create humor. Often he creates humor through the deadpan delivery of very ridiculous lines, offbeat pacing, or quirky diction. Anderson also creates humor through the formalization of events that usually are not that formal. For example, in the Grand Budapest Hotel, there's a group of characters that have to break out from a prison, and the escape plan is presented in a very formal way when often in reality it wouldn't actually be that way. Anderson films also often feature obsessive characters, adults that act like children, and children that act unusually mature for their age. This can be observed in Moonrise Kingdom as the children act very mature and the adults do not. His films also often feature stories about fathers and sons, and they also often deal with harsh realities and violence, but through the way that he crafts his films, they don't feel that violent or harsh. They almost feel like a storybook. Anderson, after he writes his own scripts, and after he finishes writing the script, that's when he'll start figuring out how he's going to make it. He works with his actors beforehand. He is very particular about casting and locations. For example, he looked for a year before casting the lead in Rushmore, and also it took him a long time to find the location for Rushmore also. He also makes animatics, which are these animated storyboards, and he'll dub his voiceover over the storyboards with dialogue and narration. He'll also do test shoots beforehand, and during the production, he will he'll have his animatics on a tablet and he'll reference it. And he also adapts how he directs to the actor that he's working with. Anderson finds confidence in the knowledge that he knows his story better than anyone else. He also doesn't compromise once he gets committed to a shot. For example, the ending crane shot in the Royal Tenenbaums took him a lot of takes to get right. He also can pull a performance out of a person. For example, in The Life Aquatic, there was one scene with a walk and talk with this lady that was an extra just for that day. And she kept getting her lines wrong, but instead of changing how he shot that scene, he just had patience and kept doing it until she finally got it right. During filming, Anderson will watch on a monitor, but he'll also stay very close to the actors and where they're filming. He'll also often insert himself into the film. For example, if a scene has narration, then he'll read that narration from the script himself as they shoot the scene. He'll also cue lights himself, and for example, in the Grand Budapest Hotel, there was a shot where a pastry needed to be cut from like a close-up, and he did that himself. He also pays attention to the whole film, the whole frame, not just part of it. For example, if he sees an extra in the background that he doesn't like how they're positioned, he will reposition them how he wants them. And the last director that I focused on was Edgar Wright, who has directed films such as Hot Fuzz, Last Night in Soho, Baby Driver, Shaun of the Dead, and Scott Pilgrim. So Wright mostly makes genre films. For example, so far he's made genre films. So far he's made a zombie film, a cop film, an alien invasion film, a comic book film, a getaway driver film, and a horror film. He's also known for making comedic films and also for his action sequences. And throughout his films, he'll also often reference pop culture, and he'll also visually reference other films, as illustrated in the photos. On the left is a frame from Point Break, and on the right is a frame from Hot Fuzz, in which he references Point Break. Edgar Wright also uses very creative transitions. This can be observed in Scott Pilgrim in a sequence in which the protagonist goes out on a date. Instead of cutting the scene conventionally, he'll place the transition between a shot, reverse shot, and he'll also use wipes to hide cuts. He also often uses these sort of mini montages to create transitions between scenes. And these montages will often feature extreme close-ups, quick editing, zooms, amplified sound effects, And often these montages he'll use these sort of amplified, heightened montages to depict very mundane activities like doing paperwork and hot fuzz, or just like getting ready for your day as shown in Shaun of the Dead, or like moving to a new city as shown in Shaun of the Dead. Wright will also create humor in these like mini montages by subverting the montage, by like interrupting the rhythm of the montage. For example, in Scott Pilgrim, he has a montage where the character is getting ready to go fight the main antagonist, and after setting up like this that he's getting ready, he'll have the character stop on a very slow shot of him tying his shoe before zooming in on that shot also, and then having the character run off. He also uses film to make a lot of visual humor. For example, he'll have things always entering and exiting the frame in humorous ways. For example, in Hot Fuzz, he'll often have like a telephone, just have a hand reach in with a telephone for a person if they have a call. And his films also often feature super dramatic lighting cues, like the flicker of a light on a blade in Shaun of the Dead. He'll also create visual puns through editing. This can be observed in Hot Fuzz as he intercuts a person being murdered with these two other characters going and watching these different action films. And for example, as a pun, he has one character say like, "You're pulling my leg," and then he'll cut to a scene of the guy pulling the other guy's leg as he drags him through a room. He also uses a lot of repetition and has repeated jokes throughout films and throughout his filmography. For example, he has a running joke of characters running at a fence and then jumping over them, or running through them, or falling through them. And so he uses a lot of visual gags and creates a lot of visual humor throughout his films. Wright will also synchronize the events of a sequence, so he'll synchronize like the actors' movements and or camera movements or the editing with the music that he's using to score his films. He uses a lot of sound effects in his films as well. He uses both diegetic and non-diegetic sound effects. These sound effects are also often amplified for a visceral effect. The transitions are also motivated and carried by sound effects. He'll also hide cuts and wipes accompanied by sound effects. He'll use sound effects with camera movements, and he'll use sound effects with objects that pass in front of the camera. So Wright gets inspired by music. He also uses animatics and storyboards. During a production, he will sometimes put the storyboard up on a large board so that everyone in the production can see it, so that they'll know exactly what they're filming and when. He also will often play music on a set, especially if the scene that they're shooting is going to be accompanied by that music in the final edit. He'll also sometimes use a metronome to make sure that the timing is exactly correct. He also watches on a monitor, and in his films, there's often very little improvisation. The majority of it is scripted, and he'll also use Texas switches to pull off stunts or to have characters. Yeah. So, for example, in one of the jumping over the fence stunts that he that joke, he'll have one character jump over the fence and then they'll disappear behind the fence, and then a stunt double will run out and jump over the fence and continue the shot that way. So all three of these directors persisted through early struggles. Mainly Wes Anderson's first film, Bottle Rocket, came out to wasn't wellly recepted by critics, and Fincher, his first feature was Alien 3, which got a lot of pushback from the studio and eventually wasn't that successful. All three directors have worked with the same people, cast and crew, again and again. Edgar Wright often collaborates with Simon Pegg and Nick Frost. Anderson has worked with Bill Murray, Jason Schwartzman, and many other actors throughout his career, such as Owen Wilson. And he also has used the same DP on the majority of his films, Robert Yeoman. And Fincher has also worked with a lot of the same collaborators, such as Brad Pitt. So yes, and then this is my works cited. So
Thank you, Julie. Questions for Julie? I have a question. Is it a coincidence or is this a very white male dominated field?
Yes, so in the past, this field has been very dominated by white men, although in recent years, we've seen a lot of an increase in female directors and directors of minorities. I just picked 3 directors that I like, regardless of their race or their gender. I just picked 3 people who I admire their filmography and the films that they've created.
Yeah, good. Excellent.
Yeah.
Julie, which one is your favorite and why?
Oh, that's a hard one. I don't know. I watched Fight Club like when I was making this, and that is a very good film. I don't know.
All right, I got a question, Julie.
Yeah.
If you had, so there's 3 really distinct artists that are producing those films. They have very distinct styles. So what would be, let's say, one word that you would say that they all 3 would share, that you would say would be the foundation of why they are really successful artistically?
Strong vision
Strong.
and persistence.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you so much. So we're going to break for lunch and our poster session. So please feel free to help yourself to lunch. And while you're dining, you can enjoy the poster presentations of Jill Flanagan's students. And they should be standing with their poster and they can tell you all about their work and answer your questions. And for those on the live stream, we will resume around 12:45. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. So please, if you're eating, please continue eating. I hope everyone enjoyed lunch. We're going to resume and with the start of our afternoon session. Our first afternoon presenter, Julia Noriega, is sick, so she was not able to be with us today, but fortunately, she recorded her presentation, and so I'm going to play it for you. Unfortunately, she's not available to answer questions, but you'll still get to hear about her work. So let me just pull up her video.
you for coming to my presentation. I'm doing my PowerPoint presentation.
Let's see if we can work on the volume.
On fast fashion, its effects, and some of its solutions. So before we get into it, let's do a quick topic outline. So what we're going to be talking about today is the development of the fast fashion industry and modern fashion industry as we know it. We're going to establish what is fast fashion, and then we're going to talk about some of those detrimental effects. So in the next section, after we kind of establish what fast fashion is, we're going to talk about those detrimental effects, which include labor violations and safety concerns, the environment, and how the consumer plays into that. But when we do that, we're also going to talk about some of the solutions, which include buying from sustainable brands, buying secondhand, and decreasing overall consumption. So how did the fast fashion industry develop? It first started, at least for the purposes of our presentation, with the adoption of standardized measurements, predominantly in Spain, with Spanish tailoring books in the 1700s to 1600s, or 1600s to 1700s. So then after the development of standardized measurement was the emergence of the boutique. Predominantly in England and Spain around the 1700s and 1800s, women were allowed to go out and shop without having their husbands and fathers accompany them. So it became a place for women to socialize. And it also was a place where designers and manufacturers were able to collect all of their clothing in one particular spot. And then after we have the emergence of the boutique, around the time of industrialization in the 1850s and 1900s, we have the development of the department store. So we all know a department store, Sears, Macy's, JCPenney, and these department stores, like the boutique, were a place where designers and manufacturers could fill a storefront with their products. The development of the department stores was aided by the Industrial Revolution because of the emergence of electric sewing machines and weaving machines. And from the department store, we get fast fashion in about the 1990s and early 2000s as the world continued to become globalized and more people were having a unified fashion sense. Brands were increasing their own production. So let's define fast fashion now that we know how it really came about. So fast fashion is often defined as the democratization of fashion. And what that means is that it just became accessible to a lot more people. And it was accessible in terms of price and in terms of simply being able to go out to a store and get clothes. For example, you can go to your local mall and go and get clothes. So some brands that are fast fashion brands are Shein, Zara, Topshop, and Doc Martens, which you wouldn't really think is a fast fashion brand. So what is wrong with fast fashion? Because cheap and accessible seem really great, but they come at the cost of labor violations, safety concerns, pollution to our environment, and to us as the consumer. So let's start off first, labor violations. A lot of garment workers, particularly in low and middle income countries, experience wage theft. So what does this mean? A lot of workers work long hours. Sources vary, but between 10 to 16-hour workdays. And in these workdays, they may be getting a minimum wage, but it doesn't mean that they're getting a living wage. So in order to kind of get that living wage, they work those extra long hours. This next slide is going to show us that difference between the living wage and the minimum wage. And it shows a couple of low and middle income countries, but let's look particularly at Cambodia, which uses our same currency. The minimum wage, you can see that bottom lower number, is $194 a month, but the living wage is $588. So while factory owners and brands might be paying the technical, legal minimum wage and technically not doing anything that they can be penalized by, their workers are not getting a living wage. They cannot support themselves. So who's predominantly affected by this? As far as garment workers go, it's women and children. Majority of garment workers alone are women. And unfortunately, a lot of women who are garment workers are still beholden to their fathers and husbands. And in some cases, will have to give up their wages to them, which is very unfortunate and only further puts on the pressure to make more money. In addition to that, they are often the primary caretakers of their family, which means like they have to bring their children to work with them. And this leads kids to having the opportunity to start working in factories. And unfortunately, some factory owners actually, in some cases, prefer child labor because children are less likely to complain about long hours and low pay. And in some cases, their nimble fingers can do better at cutting and sewing. So we've established what some of the labor violations are. Let's talk about safety concerns, particularly with infrastructure. So looking just at infrastructure, we can see that a lot of buildings have poor infrastructure and often poor ventilation, which we'll get into a little bit later. And a lot of factories which produce for fashion brands are actually subcontracted. So brands aren't 100% liable sometimes for the condition of their factories. This statistic on the bottom shows us that for 6 years, between 2006 to 2012, 600 garment workers died in factories producing for Gap, Abercrombie, and H&M. And that's just over 6 years. 600 people died. So one amazing example of infrastructure issues that have led to deaths is Rana Plaza in Bangladesh. It was a factory that collapsed in 2013. So what happened in Rana Plaza? In April of 2013, factory owners learned about infrastructure issues that were visible from the exterior of the building and decided to do nothing about it despite worker complaints. So the month went on, and on April 24th, the building collapsed. About 2,000 or 3,000 people were killed, sources vary on exactly how many, and 1,000 were left injured. We can see on this next slide, if you saw the picture before, that was all of the damage. Not all of the floors were used for fast fashion production, but I believe about half of them were. If we look at this House of Cards picture, we can see that the collapse happened at about 8:45, and work had only started at 8 a.m. that same day. So we talk about infrastructure, but that's not all that garment workers face. They also have a number of dangers to their health. So garment workers, to complete their work sitting, they do long hours, repetitive tasks, and they experience poor ventilation, as we mentioned earlier. So those repetitive tasks are the rapid cutting and sewing. As a result of those long hours, the rapid cutting and sewing, sedentary work, they are exposed or put at a high risk of musculoskeletal and cardiovascular disease. So in addition to that, that poor ventilation exposes them to extreme heat chemicals and to inhalation of the microfibers from cottons and textiles that they're working with. So let's talk a little bit about all of those things in a little bit more depth. A report talking about garment workers in the LA fashion district right here in America actually came out and publicized that 60% of garment workers in the LA fashion district reported having insufficient ventilation, and 72% reported having a lot of dust in their workspaces. That musculoskeletal and cardiovascular diseases, the same report tells us that garment workers are far more likely to get these diseases than people in different manufacturing industries. And when they do get them, they're more likely to be more severe and more long-term. Those harmful and intense chemicals that they're exposed to because of poor ventilation, two examples of those are formaldehyde, which is a flame retardant, and silver, which is a metal that's used as an antibacterial. And so even though we get the clothes and they're fine after maybe weeks or a few days of processing, those long hours and poor ventilation of being exposed to those things, the metal and the chemicals, actually leaves garment workers at a high risk of poor health. So safety concerns, labor violation, workers are overworked, underpaid, they experience poor working conditions, unsafe infrastructure, and exposed to poor ventilation and harsh chemicals. So our environment, it's not over, unfortunately. There are some really bad environmental impacts that fast fashion causes. So first is water waste, next we have chemical pollution, and then we have consumer waste, which is actually something that very directly applies to us. If we look at this water waste, this slide is looking specifically at cotton production. up in here, this first like little white block tells us that it takes over 2,000 liters to produce one t-shirt and one pair of jeans. 2,000. This slide right here tells us that that same amount of water could be used for 2.5 years of drinking water for somebody. And considering that this is just one pair of jeans and one t-shirt, let's think about how there are 1 billion new garments produced every year, and this only considers cotton production. So chemical pollution. We kind of talked about this a little bit earlier with the use of water, but there are 8,000 chemicals used in the production process from start to end. And with the use of water, it results in a lot of chemical runoff, which results in rivers in China that look like this. So because of all this runoff, all of this chemical usage, fast fashion comes out to being the second largest industry polluter, only second to agriculture. In addition to that, the runoff that comes from the chemicals often leaks into waterways and air systems of locals who work in those factories. And sometimes when chemicals are allowed to leak into water systems, it actually prevents the natural water purification systems, and drinking water and other municipal water systems become contaminated. So consumer waste. One of the last things about the negative impacts of fast fashion, if we look at it globally, clothes only have a lifespan of 5.4 years, which is crazy. 95% are recyclable, but only 15% are, which means that the remaining 80% end up in landfills, which are sometimes just sold back to the low and middle income countries which produce them to be sold either as solid waste or in secondhand markets. In America alone, we buy about 80 billion pieces a year, and 85% of that is sent to landfills. So let's look at the consumer a little bit more, a little bit closer down, not necessarily looking at waste. So one of the things that fast fashion is marked by is really intense and aggressive marketing, which sells the idea of luxury. You can look at any fast fashion ad or campaign, and you can see that they're selling the idea that you'll be cool, you'll be socially accepted. Especially this comes to fruition with the partnering with influencers who often sell the idea that you will be famous or you can go on vacations. And even though people know that obviously you're not going to get that when you buy the clothes, it's still instilling the idea that with clothes comes status. And who's most directly impacted by this? Women are. We are impacted far more by fast fashion just through marketing. We talked a little bit about it earlier about how the emergence of the boutique allowed women a place to go and socialize, and that has carried over into fast fashion as women are now the spotlight. They are the main focus of marketing, and because of this, we have become the main people who purchase into fast fashion, and so we become the targets, the protagonists, and the victims of fast fashion. So not only are we seen as the people who are responsible for upholding it, but we're also seen as the people who are responsible for taking it down, regardless of our role in production. So all of this stuff is really no fun, but there are solutions to fast fashion, and there are alternatives. So some of these alternatives, like we said earlier, include buying from sustainable brands, buying secondhand, and decreasing your overall consumption. So what does it mean to buy sustainable? What does sustainability mean? It's a practice or an object that can maintain itself over a long period of time. And that same thing goes for fashion. Brands who produce sustainably or are sustainable brands are marked by having simple staple pieces, having transparent production lines, creating with low energy and low water intense materials, and unfortunately, they also have high price tag. So one great example of a brand that I think is amazing is the Girlfriend Collective. They produce unisex activewear for both men and women. And one example that I have up here is these amazing, really cute green leggings. I don't know if you can see it from over there, but if you see up here, that price tag is $8, which is honestly so expensive, unfortunately. But we can see why. Under sustainability and manufacturing, the website, in a very clear and defined spot, explains that they produce with factories that guarantee worker rights and with materials that are good for the environment. So it is a justified price point, but for many people, that price point can be a barrier. And if you're looking for an alternative that is less expensive, we can shop secondhand. And what does secondhand even mean? It's not too complicated. It just means that you're not the first owner of a garment or of an object at all. So there are many ways to shop secondhand. They include going to your local thrift stores, sourcing from vintage and antique shops, and buying online. I personally like to use Depop a lot. That's where I got these sneakers. And then you can also buy from eBay, who sells clothes and a myriad of other objects. So why is fast fashion great? Or why is buying secondhand great, not fast fashion? Buying secondhand is great because you can get unique garments that are just personally yours. You'll know that nobody else has them. And they have low price tags, especially compared to our sustainable options and to some of our fast fashion options. But what is unfortunate is that it's really time consuming. You can go to a thrift store and not have a full guarantee about what you're going to get. And in addition to that, even though it's fading in modern times, there was or has been a stigma associated with shopping from secondhand stores. So the final and probably most accessible way to combat fast fashion is to decrease your overall consumption. As we saw, sustainable brands are great because they produce high quality and ethical pieces, but at a high cost point. Thrifting, again, great. You get unique prices, low cost, but it's not super time friendly. What decreasing consumption does is it costs no money and no time. All it costs is you to think about what you're buying and why you want to buy it. And there are a couple ways to decrease your consumption and be conscious about what you wear. And that is, you can wear something 30 times, ensure that you have gotten the full life out of your garment, ensure that you love it or you hate it, and you know that because you've worn it. In addition to that, you can think about your cost per wear. If you're going to buy a new item, like those leggings that we just saw, and you think, you probably won't wear them a lot, it might not be worth it for the cost per wear to get something new. In addition to that, waiting to buy. It's not always bad to buy new things, but if you wait to buy, you know that you've allowed yourself time to get past that impulse of wanting to get something new, but you can justify that purchase to yourself. So, a little overview about what we talked about. Those labor violations and safety concerns, one of the most major issues with fast fashion. In addition to this, the industry is polluting our environment and causing a lot of detrimental effects to us, the consumer. But there are alternatives. Buying from sustainable brands, buying secondhand, and increasing your overall consumption. But the issue is really complicated, and not one answer is going to be perfect for everybody. And that's okay. That's okay as long as you are thinking about what you're doing, thinking about what you're wearing, and where you get it from. That is okay. And so there's no right answer. And as long as you remember that, you will be good and you will be a conscious consumer. Thank you all for listening.
Julia was going to try to join the live stream. So if you're listening, Julia, beautiful job. But unfortunately, she won't be available to answer any questions. Let me pull up our next presentation. Okay. So our next presenter is going in the wrong direction. You coming back? Okay. So our next presenter is Oliver Franco, and he is going to be talking about the complexity of psychotic disorders. So you can either use this to advance the slides or this. Make sure to come back to the mic.
Okay. All right, hi everyone. My name is Oliver Franco. As Dr. Levy said, I will be doing a presentation on the complexity of psychotic disorders. Now, before I start, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart as a person living with schizophrenia. So I really wanted to do this project to educate and kill some stigmas around psychosis. Okay, there we go. So psychosis, what is it? So put simply, it's a disconnection from reality. It's more of a term, it's an umbrella term rather than just one solid definition. So basically everything falls under the umbrella of psychosis. So all symptoms, all disorders, they're all under psychosis. All right, so a brief history. It was once thought to be a part of witchcraft. So people who were perceived as psychotic individuals were often tried as witches and were thrown into asylums and labeled as crazy. And at one point, it was described as a psychic neurosis, which is a brain disease. Now it's more so thought of as a neurodevelopmental disorder. And so now we use the term psychosis. So psych meaning the soul, osis being an abnormal condition. Okay, so some stigmas around psychosis and psychotic individuals. So people often think that when it comes to schizophrenia or psychosis as a whole, the individuals are dangerous or they're crazy or they can't lead a normal life, when this is very, very wrong, because psychosis is also a spectrum as well as an umbrella where people can fall on different points on the spectrum. So one person can be a higher functioning individual and one person may need to live in a hospital or a psychiatric facility. But yeah, people with psychosis, most of us can function very well. We are, normal everyday people. Okay, so positive symptoms. So with psychosis and psychotic disorders, there are two main types of symptoms. We have positive symptoms and negative symptoms. So positive symptoms add to the condition of the individual. They bring more to what the person is experiencing when it comes to reality and just the world that you perceive. So two main positive symptoms, the most common, are delusions and hallucinations. So paranoia also ties into delusions as it's this fixed beliefs. So delusions are also fixed beliefs that the person may believe, and they can vary in intensity. Some people can recognize that their delusions are delusions, and some people unfortunately cannot, depending on the severity of their psychosis. And then, of course, like I said, the hallucinations, which I will be getting to in a second. Okay, so delusions, like I said, fixed beliefs, and they sometimes they have very interesting content to them. So the main delusion most people think of when it comes to psychosis is persecutory type delusions. These include delusions that someone is being either followed or surveilled by a higher power. Lots of times you'll hear people will say maybe it's a government force that's going after the individual, so they feel like they're in danger or they're being watched or surveilled. Like sometimes they may think that there's cameras watching them or cameras in the walls. It really varies, but it's usually just a feeling of danger and a feeling of being like surveilled by a higher force. Delusions of grandeur. So these are very different from persecutory type delusions where they kind of give the individual a sense of power, like a higher power that they're related to either the universe or they have certain abilities that they can predict the future and they feel like they're tied to certain things in the universe. It's a very, very interesting type of delusion. And then lastly, we have erotomania, which is a little lesser known delusion. This is where an individual may believe that someone's madly in love with them. This can be either a celebrity or a person walking down the street, maybe a friend. It's very centered around feeling like the person is being in love by. Okay. Okay, so fun part is the hallucinations. So these involve all five senses. So with hallucinations, it's an adding to the five senses. So we have auditory, which affects 70% of people who experience hallucinations. So this can be voices, which most people associate with auditory hallucinations. This can also be noises, like sometimes someone can hear like someone's breaking into their house, or they're breaking a window, but most of the time it is voices. And the voices also have different nature to them. So they can be, there's a voice called the command hallucinations where the person is hearing voices that are telling them to do things, such as maybe hurt someone or drive their car off the road. It really varies, but the command hallucinations are usually not nice hallucinations. Visual is another very well-known hallucination. So the person sees things. It's just they see things that aren't there. A common shared visual hallucination in the community are these things called shadow people, which are these dark figures that can either appear in rooms or on the side of the road. I mean, I've seen them before. Usually they're on the side of the road or other locations as well. Then we have tactile hallucinations, which involve the sense of touch. So people can feel burning or this is a thing called formication, where people will feel bugs crawling around their skin. They can either be feeling that they're under the skin or on the skin, and it's very uncomfortable. Olfactory hallucinations are the sense of smells. Some people can, once again, this varies. So people can smell good smells, sometimes bad smells, sometimes neutral smells. It's very interesting that even, we can just smell things that aren't really there. And then lastly, we have gustatory hallucinations, which involve the sense of taste. And actually, some people can also feel gustatory hallucinations where they feel like there's something inside their body. Okay, so like I said, we have the positive symptoms, which add us to the experience. Now we have negative symptoms, which take away. So these are less known when it comes to psychosis. So first we have cognitive impairment. So this kind of includes memory problems is a very common one. We also have concentration issues, and there's comprehension issues. And disorganized thought kind of ties into cognitive impairment, where someone may have trouble understanding something, and they won't be able to have a solid train of thought. And then social withdrawal, it's a very severe pulling away of socializing with people. So it's not just like, oh, I don't want to go out, I'm tired. It's like the very severe pulling away from them. Okay, so we have some potential causes to psychosis. There is no one true cause. We don't even to this day. There is definitely a variety of theories, but we don't have one solid answer. So one theory is substance use. There is I will get to in a moment, a psychotic disorder called substance-induced psychosis. So this can be brought on by use of substances, either too much substances. It really depends on the person and their body. Then we have genetics. So of course, many mental illnesses do have a genetic tie into it. So if we're looking at identical twins, if one of them develops psychotic disorder, the other twin has a 50% chance of also becoming psychotic. And then we have a relationship called the diathesis-stress relationship, which states that a person is predisposed to develop a psychotic disorder, and then they experience a trauma, and that kind of sparks psychosis. So this can range from a dog dying and go as far as getting in a severe accident. Okay, so we have some common psychotic disorders. We have psychotic disorder, which is just a general psychosis. So usually that's where psychiatrists will start, is they'll go with psychotic disorder, depending on the symptoms of the person, and duration of symptoms also affect diagnoses. Then we have schizophrenia, which is a very, very well-known, obviously, psychotic disorder. I mean, people usually think psychosis, they think schizophrenia. And that's usually diagnosed using 3 criteria from the DSM-5, the most recent DSM. Then we have schizoaffective disorder, which is kind of like schizophrenia, but it has bipolar features. Either the individual may experience mania or depression. It can be both, it can be just one, but usually that's been observed as a significant mood disorder along with the psychosis. And then we have delusional disorder, which is a little easier of a psychotic disorder. It's just basically mostly delusions. There can be some hallucinations, but it's like an overpowering of just delusions only, different variety of delusions. And then, as I mentioned just a minute ago, we have substance-induced psychotic disorder. Okay, so lastly, we have treatments. So while there is no one cause, there's also no one treatment plan. So mostly we use medication and therapy. So with medication, the medication used for psychosis are called antipsychotics, obviously. We have first generation and second generation. So first generation are typical antipsychotics, and second generation are atypical antipsychotics. So first generation, I'm sure you can guess, are older. They're usually from the 50s and the 60s. And now we are still developing more atypical antipsychotics to this day. And then we have therapy. So people with psychosis often have a clinician or a doctor or psychiatrist, usually both. And with the clinician and the psychiatrist, you can work on treatment plans. Psychiatrist prescribes medication, and that's usually where you go and you get, You get observed, they take in your symptoms, and then they make a diagnosis that way. And symptoms also have to have a certain duration, as I mentioned earlier, which goes into diagnosing a person. And then working with a clinician. So very, very helpful coping skill is called fact checking or reality checking, where you can use other people in your life who are in your care team to kind of just ask if do you see that I'm seeing? Do you hear what I'm hearing? So it's just using people who don't have psychosis to kind of just really check what the reality is. But at the end of the day, everyone with psychosis has their own different story, and it's not just one set in stone thing. Every person has their own difficult and different experience. But at the end of the day, everyone is unique, and there is a plan, and there's a treatment for this. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Oliver. And as he said, any questions?
Yes.
If you could step up to the mic so those on the live stream could hear you, that would be wonderful. Yes.
I just had a general question too about these disorders. Do all of them include psychoses? And to what degree do they need to be?
So with psychotic disorders, they all have psychotic features, which I said, they're just kind of disconnection from reality. And so it really depends on, like I said, duration of said psychotic symptoms. So I know with certain diagnoses, it has to be like a minimum of 6 months with these psychotic disorder or symptoms. So they all do require psychosis and psychotic symptoms. And it really depends on each person, how long they've experienced it, and then how intense they are as well.
Okay, great. And then I had another question.
Sure.
My sister is actually schizophrenic, and she had a lot of trouble being diagnosed because she also had difficulty with drug and alcohol abuse. I guess I'm kind of also processing as I'm going with this question, but how can they differentiate between, like I've never seen drug-induced, like I've never seen it that way.
Yeah.
In order to have these diagnoses, would you have to be considered, I guess, sober or, not under the influence of drugs or alcohol?
I would say I'm not entirely sure about that, but I do believe it really depends. Everything depends on the person and their situation. So I think that if the psychiatrist can kind of note that they've either been using a certain substance for this amount of time or that, like how often they do, they can use that to kind of go with the substance-induced psychosis. So that really depends on the history of that person or substance use.
Okay. And I also just wanted to say thank you for your transparency about your own experiences.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. So thank you.
So hi, just a quick question. I know you weren't focused, Oliver, on treatment, but as that's sort of what is left up there, and I don't know how much insight you have into this right now, but I know you mentioned sort of older school antipsychotics and a newer strain. In terms of therapies, have you in any of your experience or studies noticed that there's also an evolution in terms of the therapeutic treatments?
Are you asking like as therapy regressed?
I guess so. And are there different approaches?
Yeah, I would say there are different approaches, kind of old school approaches. There's even ECT, which is electroconvulsive therapy, where the person goes in, I want to say 3 or 4 times a week, and they experience like seizures in the brain. They put them down, they put them under, and they make the brain have seizures. And that's an older treatment to psychosis. But now we have atypical antipsychotics as well as different programs for clinicians to help psychotic individuals with perceiving their reality. So there are old-fashioned treatment plans, and there's also way newer ones too.
Okay, thanks. Well done.
Anyone
Thank
else?
you so much, Oliver.
Okay.
Oh, wait, Oliver. Big. All right. No, you're good. All right. So you can do this. Caught up in the finding your PowerPoint slides. I apologize. So our next presenter is Maya Carpentino, who will be talking about managing land for environmental priorities. So we'll hear about the importance of parks. Thank you, Maya.
Hello. So for my honors capstone, I chose to present on the value and necessity of parks, but specifically how we can manage this land for environmental priorities. Esteemed naturalist and famed philosopher Henry David Thoreau once said that in wilderness is the preservation of the world. It's our responsibility to maintain and protect unindustrialized land and its resources to ensure the preservation of environmental sustainability. Moreover, designating land preserves and managing them to best benefit ecosystems is often carried out by government agencies, both on the federal and state level. For example, on the federal level, we have the National Park System, we have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, we have the U.S. Forest Service, and on the state level, we have agencies such as the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, or the DEEP. Furthermore, in this presentation, I hope to enforce that by understanding the purpose of land conservation, agencies can effectively manage preserved land to sustain wilderness and subsequently environmental longevity. Land preserved are established geographical areas that are maintained to conserve natural features and ecosystems. These parks act as natural resource reserves established to protect wilderness from further human activity. The connectivity between organisms and their environments can be represented by hundreds of different components. And if one of these components is compromised, this machine either functions poorly or ceases to function at all. Therefore, the units that make up an ecosystem contribute to the overall health of an area. In addition to just preserving land for its natural beauty and wilderness, populations rely on functioning ecosystems for valuable services such as clean air, clean water, nutrient-rich soils, pollination, and even food. For ages, government institutions have been investing in their natural wonders. According to the National Park Service, Ulysses S. Grant signed the Yellowstone National Park Act in 1872, and thus the world's first national park was created. Originally, parks were established to preserve beautiful landscapes. However, with the rise of drastic urbanization, it is apparent that more land must be maintained to benefit ecosystems and environmental longevity. The book Keeping the Wild explains that parks are ultimately a clear moral statement that those recognize the need to safeguard natural processes, indigenous species, and native landscapes for their right to exist. Subsequently, more and more government institutions are recognizing the importance of protecting wilderness before it becomes too late. As of 2014, formally designated national and international protected areas now number over 150,000 and include more than 24 million square kilometers of land and water and cover more than 12% of the surface of Earth. The significance of the establishment of protected land ensures that governments have stake in the future of the environment. This graph here, provided by IUCN and the Protected Planet, it kind of gives a representation of where a lot of this protected land is concentrated. You can see in Greenland there's a lot, like a huge chunk. You see Alaska, a lot in South America, around in the Amazon, the Himalayas, South Africa, and even Australia. It also shows that the East Coast has a long way to go. Urbanization has drastically altered the natural environment, leading to the reduction of biodiversity, which ensures the health of our ecosystems. Most recently, the effects of the Industrial Revolution have contributed habitat degradation to the largest scale. The World Wildlife Fund states that habitat loss is probably the greatest threat to the variety of life on this planet today. It is identified as the main threat to more than 85% of all species described in IUCN's Red List, so the list provided by the International Unit of Nature Conservation, which establishes the species that are most vulnerable. This is a visualization of data compiled by World Wildlife Fund's 2018 Living Planet report, and you can see that the red indicates the decline of bird, reptile, and fish species is mostly accredited to this habitat degradation. According to a study done by Tufts University using satellite images over the course of 30 years, data revealed that imperiled species lost the least habitat on federally protected land and the most habitat on private lands that are not protected. Evidence suggests that protected land promotes biodiversity and ecosystem health, and therefore it can address the issue of decreased environmental sustainability posed to modern society. To combat environmental issues that humans' populations pose is to take a proactive approach in managing parks to preserve land to the best of their ability. In the best serve environmental needs in preservation agencies, we must apply scientific knowledge and quality management approaches. The most fundamental principle of management should be to continuously apply methods proposed by scientific research in the ecological and environmental fields of study. For example, ecosystem-based management incorporates scientific knowledge in the establishment and maintenance of preserves. Greenfacts.org best describes it as an approach to maintaining and restoring the composition, structure, function, and delivery of services of natural and modified ecosystems for the goal of achieving sustainability. Comprehensive ecological knowledge is needed to make or propose any decisions concerning the environmental sustainability of an area. Without an understanding of the interactions between organisms and their specific environments, how can land preservation management agencies ensure that they are preserving wilderness to the best of their ability? This is highlighted here in the famous case of the reintroduction of gray wolves into the Yellowstone National Park. Population control practices of the predator were enforced between the 1800s and 1900s. And by the 1970s, no gray wolves could be found within the bounds of Yellowstone Park at all. As a keystone species, the vast ecosystem of Yellowstone was in serious distress due to a lack of a major natural predator. By 1994, the entirety of the park was able to implement management practices to reestablish this population. This plan turned out to be a great success, and today there is recorded to be about 100 wolves inhabiting the bounds of the area. This case represents a crucial milestone in ecosystem science services. In this graph here, you can see with the implementation of this practice, and around the early 1995, 1994, there was probably about less than 25 wolves recorded. But today, right at that point, there's about to be 100 wolves recorded in the 2020 time. This also is represented by the line of the entire Yellowstone ecosystem, greater area where the wolves inhabit and go around, is that there's a much greater, population represented. Another important aspect highlighted by ecological science is that large connected areas of wilderness is correlated to a greater ecosystem health. An argument addressing the importance of science in environmental management and land preservation agencies would not be complete without including the importance of connectivity. No area of land stands alone from the rest of its surroundings, and surroundings are as important to the park as the area within it. Fragmentation that urbanization has created amongst natural resources is seriously deterring wilderness conservation progress. The best conservation science has confirmed that there is a need for larger core protected areas linked together by wildlife corridors. In addition to applying conservation efforts within their designated preserved land, agencies should actively pursue opportunities to expand their protected zone and develop connectivity corridors between nearby wilderness. And even if it isn't inherently probable at the time to acquire more land, management should still be cognizant of the effectiveness and conservation efforts that fostering further ecosystem connectivity will have on the environment. In this chart here, provided by a study, you can see that level of fragmented habitat, corresponds to the IUCN species risk assessment, where the endangered species, the vulnerable species, have a much higher level of fragmentation as compared to those that are least concerned or near threatened. Another management objective of land preservation agencies is to manage ecosystems under quality standards. Established management frameworks offers management details on how to maximize the capacity that the agency has in maintaining and establishing quality in their parks' natural resources, ecosystem quality, and their visitor experience. The Protected Area Visitor Impact Management Frameworks article states that frameworks provide a formal process for specifying prescriptive management objectives that define desired resource and social conditions, and these select appropriate indicators and standards that are reflected in these objectives. Two such of these quality management frameworks are the Limits of Acceptable Change, LAC, developed by the U.S. Forest Service, and the Visitor Experience and Resource Protection, VERP, developed by the National Park Service. This is emphasized by the article, A Comparative Analysis of the Protected Area Framework, Planning and Management Frameworks. The LAC framework addresses concerns as its process identifies the resource and social value of a park and outlines actions that management needs to take to preserve them. Similarly, VERP is a newer framework that encompasses the standards of the LAC framework. It emphasizes the total number of people that can comfortably visit a park without compromising the ecological integrity of an area, and subsequently explains how to maintain the quality of said park. Here's a flow chart on how the LAC framework and VERP utilize quality management to identify issues and implement management strategies. Finally, land preservation agencies must ensure that they have sufficient and proper funding avenues to institute conservation through management to the highest capacity. A proposed reason to why environmental preservation has perpetually been underfunded is a lack of understanding in conservation sciences. Almost all land preservation agencies are funded by the avenues of public policy. Therefore, it is important to garner support from a legislation and propose to vote the increased funding in protecting and preserving lands for the benefit of environmental health. According to the Endangered Species Act Dollars and Cents article, data suggests that increased federal and state appropriations and subsequent spending are likely to result in improved levels of recovery for more species. These results reinforce that increased environmental investment improves the overall ecological well-being of an area. The study provides this bar graph as a visual representation where species recovers correlates with the funds spent for its recovery efforts, as the y-axis represents the median proportion of funds spent. We need to ensure that land preservation agencies are establishing and maintaining land to promote wilderness and ecological health. In 2022, environmental crisis surrounds human society more than it ever has. And unfortunately, the degradation of the environment will continue with the prospect of developable land and/or resource exploitation. Like all environmental crises, there's no time to wait around to take action. Humankind relies on the ecosystem services that wilderness offers, and if the land is not protected in the interests of conservation, humans will not be able to sustain on this Earth's resources for much longer. Moreover, I wanted to say that in my internship at the Connecticut General Assembly this past semester, I learned how much our public policy relies on input from the public. Our elected officials work to pass bills and subsequent spending to represent the interests of their constituents. If you have an issue that you feel passionately about, it is your democratic responsibility to ensure that you are heard by your legislators. As someone who has been working alongside the co-chair of the Environment Committee, I can assure you that our state's legislature is serious about addressing environmental concerns, and they need your support to carry this out at the best capacity. I urge you to please reach out to your legislators and municipalities to support the protection of our land. Congressional and state elections are this year, so please vote for legislators that will actively work to protect our environment. Here are my works cited for our presentation. And if you have any questions about reaching out to your legislators or anything else about the content of my presentation, please don't hesitate to ask me any questions, or even you can reach out to my email that I put there. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Maya. Questions? Leah, here.
Hi, I just want to say very good presentation. And I wanted to ask, are you thinking more about in your future, because I know that you were looking to go into environmental science, are you thinking of going more on the municipal side of things, or are you thinking more of steering toward the scientific side?
Oh, absolutely. I definitely want to pursue my future career in the avenues of policy. I think that science gets a lot of funding, right, from our government, the grants, any type of research that you hear from R1 universities gets governmental grants. So I would feel much more meaningful being able to be part of that process and allowing people to get this research that's needed for the conservation of the earth. So long story short, I am much more interested in pursuing a career in policy so that I can spread my activism to a much greater degree.
Excellent. Other questions for Maya? I have a very important question.
Yeah, of course.
What is your favorite state or national park?
So, funny story, I've actually never been to any national park in the world. I would say, though, my favorite state park is probably Devil's Hop Yard in Deep River. I was gonna say it's like Moodus area, East Haddam, Deep River Moodus area. But I also, I grew up next to a park in Durham called Miller's Pond State Park. And so it was like right next to me. So I think that's where I really established my love for open space. We need more open space, definitely, in our state. But I would love to visit all of them one day.
A good goal. Any other questions for Maya? All right, thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, our next presenter is Lacey Hall, and she will be speaking about cancer costs, broadly speaking.
Hi, I'm Lacey Hall, and before I start, I just want to say to my fellow peers who have gone before me, you've all done a great job. So again, I'm Lacey Hall, and today I'll be presenting about cancer costs, including the financial, emotional, and physical cost. Today, I will be discussing the broad costs, treatments, surgery, home care, mental health, and more. So these massive costs are more likely to rise due to the population increase and with the use of newer technology and treatments every day. The costs of cancer are endless, and for many, it's difficult to keep up the severity of the cancer, the length of the treatment, the location of treatment, and the amount of health insurance coverage if accessible. So in 2014, $87.8 billion was spent in the US on cancer-related healthcare. In 2020, it rose to even more to a whopping $208.9 billion. So again, with these cancer costs, they're gonna even rise more to the amount of cancer cases are expected to rise to 23.6 million by 2030. So the most common and expensive cancers. So research from the National Cancer Institute looked at which cancers were among the most costly with medicine and treatment accounted for. This included breast, colorectal, lung, prostate, and non-Hodgkin lymphomas. Among these cancers, 4 of them are the most top common cancers, and the last still being in the top 13. With more cases expected to come, healthcare costs are expected to rise every year. Not only will the patient have to worry about the expensive Medicare, but also transportation, childcare, not being able to work, and needing support for simple household tasks and more. So treatments. While going through treatment, it makes it nearly impossible for a patient to attempt to work to pay their debt back in a reasonable amount of time. Going through intrusive chemotherapy requires a patient to be hooked up for a machine for at least 30 minutes, hours, or even days, again, depending on the severity or type of cancer. Each dose of chemotherapy comes in something called a round. That could be the continuous treatment of doses of chemotherapy that could range from a few weeks to even months. However, these doses take a great while to complete, and one whole process that is encompassed by a whole round of chemo. The unfortunate part, it is typical for a patient to endure multiple rounds of chemotherapy before taking a break or continuing to these different treatments. For example, a typical chemotherapy session includes a blood test being taken, having a pre-appointment with a doctor to go before the results and make sure you're okay to go ahead with your course of treatment, and order the chemotherapy based on your results with the blood test, and then meet with another doctor who is administering the chemotherapy and have the IV inserted as well as the other drugs to help subside the effects of nausea. This is only in preparation and during the one dose of many chemotherapy sessions, so you can imagine how quickly the bills come up. So radiation treatments can also be very time-consuming and expensive. However, a patient with health insurance are more likely to be covered for radiation therapy while it's less invasive, unless it's radiation surgery. For those who aren't covered by health insurance, however, radiation therapy can cost to $10,000 to $50,000 or more, dependent on a patient's treatment plan or diagnosis. This is an unsettling and a very large range of costs that would easily threaten bankruptcy for the average American citizen who makes an average of $56,000 a year based on the year of 2020. So surgery. So with surgeries, they can also entail many complications or elongated stays if things don't go as planned, which does happen more than you may think. This could mean additional hospital days spent in their bed, more doctor's visits, another possible surgery, or a complication that occurs at home and an ambulance has to be called. For the number one most common cancer, breast cancer, the cost for mastectomy can reach $37,000. Let's just take a minute to think about that. $37,000 for this one surgery for breast cancer, just to remove the breast tissue, and this is without any reconstruction. This alone, without any treatment, stays, and more, is a large expense in of itself. Home care. So caring for children, or even more, when there's one parent in the home is extremely hard who wants nothing to be strong for their child. Childcare can become a very large expense very quickly, even if it's for a high school student who needs a ride home later than the bus from school. In 2019, people who put their kids in child care spent an average of $9,200 per child. Say a cancer patient has more than one child, this number would easily multiply. Thus, another way to encounter the reality of bankruptcy. Many details can group to a patient's downfall extremely quickly, while their main focus should simply be fighting this awful disease. However, many are also fighting for their houses, kids, money, and mental health. So 1 out of 3 cancer patients will develop mental health issues. The mental state of a person going through severe sickness needs counseling and support to keep fighting. This poor mental health is obviously not uncommon with cancer patients. Physical and mental hardships. A person's physical appearance will start to become unfamiliar quickly with the loss of hair, noticeable fatigue, swelling, and weight changes from the chemotherapy treatment. Their emotional state will start to weaken when their concentration has been afflicted with the common label as chemo brain. Speaking from personal experience, my mom's actually struggled with chemo brain when she was diagnosed with breast cancer and peripheral neuropathy, which is a type of nerve problem that can be irritated through certain activities and result in a painful, numbing, tingling sensation. My mom, even after radiation and chemotherapy, still struggles with peripheral neuropathy and is unable to partake in some things that she loves. She grew up taking piano lessons and absolutely loves to play the piano in the house during her free time. But now it's harder. She starts to play the piano and sometimes 2 minutes could go by, 5 minutes depending on the day, and her fingers will start to hurt because it activated her neuropathy playing the instrument. Sometimes she will wake up in the morning telling me how she couldn't sleep because her sheets activated her neuropathy in her feet and she couldn't stop the painful tingling sensation the material caused. Even though chemotherapy can help minimize or kill these cancer cells, they will always have severe effects on the body, and these effects don't always subside or go away. When a person is diagnosed with a deadly disease, their mind has to face death sometimes, and because cancer isn't kind of the body, this is a very hard occurrence to see. However, most cancer patients, after enduring the endless costs, are unable to afford the care of a professional mental health provider. The average cost of a therapist in America ranges between $100 to $200, even though most health insurance providers will cover it. Some therapists prefer out-of-pocket pay. Furthermore, most insurance companies require a sum of copay with a session. And again, the average cost of only a typical 1-hour session with a therapist is very high, and a cancer patient who is struggling with their mental health as well as their physical might want more than 1 or 2 sessions. Again, cancer patients are 2.5 more times likely to declare bankruptcy than healthy people. With all of this talk of negative mental health and all of these costs, however, positivity is possible when you have a great support group and continue fighting. To conclude, the hard reality of cancer is that no cancer survivor is truly cancer-free. There will always be those yearly follow-up visits, sometimes debt, insurance payments, or possible therapy sessions. None of these treatments after come without a large price tag attached. Finally, this illness is full of huge bills, emotional pain, and more. Billions of dollars are being used every year to help fight this disease, which is only expanding to more of the world. The costs of cancer are endless, and for many, it's difficult to keep up. It's not only the economic aspect that's difficult with cancer patients, it's also the emotional and physical distress that comes with being sick. Thank you for listening. Does anybody have any questions?
Excellent. Questions for Lacey?
I wanted to ask, you said that you had kind of struggled personally with this issues and you detailed like your experiences with your mom. Out of all of the costs that you mentioned, which one for you and your family, if you're comfortable answering, felt the most taxing? Like, was it the money or was it actually more of the like emotional piece?
Honestly, I would have to say it was more of the financial aspect, seeing the bills just kind of pile up. I know my mom actually was very organized about keeping her bills in this big binder. And still, if you look in the binder today, you can see all of the price tags that were attached to each treatment, each surgery, and so forth. And I just know that piling up was very stressful.
Other questions? So I'm wondering, so right, these costs are astronomical, right? Especially for people who don't have insurance.
Mm-hmm.
So in your experience or in your research, what did you come across in terms of kind of what ultimately happens, right? You mentioned that a lot of people end up having to declare bankruptcy.
Yes, correct.
What are the other potential outcomes when people can't pay?
Other potential outcomes, there are a lot of cancer patients who either try and not go to the hospital or push off calling an ambulance or even getting treatment. Some of them will just stop and not come to the hospital anymore because they can't keep up with it, or they keep ignoring the mail that all these bills are coming in one after the other. And sometimes they'll just completely ignore their treatment plan and just get sicker and sicker.
Yeah, there's a lot of examples of patients with severe illness choosing to put food on the table for their children instead of, getting their chemo or whatever.
Yeah, it's
taking
very, very
their
sad.
medications. Any other questions for Lacey? Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, our next presenter is Aaliyah Hayes, and she will be presenting From Page to Mind, a psychological analysis of my weirdest childhood behavior. Aaliyah, you can use it for the other side of the or and there's also a laser.
Good morning, everyone. So as you can see, my presentation is about my strangest childhood behavior. This is personally my favorite picture of me as a child. It was Christmas. I'm not sure exactly how old I was, but as you can tell, I was really into making cookies. But my presentation today is actually going to be about another one of my favorite pastimes, which is reading. When I was younger, I had what could only be described as an extremely overactive imagination. I would daydream. I had really intense, vivid dreams, even when I was sleeping. And I was just always a very creative thinker. So reading was really something that appealed to me because I was able to live out any kind of scenario that I liked. I was the grade child who was reading like those big, ridiculous novels that looked ridiculous in my hands. But When books were not available, I actually would start to imagine myself in the scenarios of the books. I'd pretend that my favorite characters were around me, and I would almost like manipulate my mind to sort of project a visualization of the characters and the books as if it was happening around me. I had a bad habit of reading when I was not supposed to, such as in all of my academic classes, so I did this all the time when the teachers would just take the book away. So the different psychological factors that are involved in this behavior, I wanted to look at both the scientific, so the neurological factors and the biological factors that play into this, as well as some of the more dependent factors like the environment and the motivations that I might have had for having this behavior. So to fully understand how this behavior came about, I really wanted to look at what the bare bones are of how do you perceive anything. So when you're presented with reading the book, you have dendrites. I have a neuron example up here, a diagram of a neuron, which is a nerve cell. And they have dendrites, which are nerves throughout your body that perceive the signals, and then they send an electrical impulse along an axon, which is that long tube, and it goes up to your actual central nervous system and into your brain, which is where everything is sort of processed, and it's really interesting because it's all interconnected. And then from the electrical signal, it actually has to be converted to chemical energy. So through vesicles, it is transported via messages, chemical messages called neurotransmitters, and their neurotransmitters are things like you hear dopamine and serotonin, and they're the things that actually transfer over to send the chemical message to the brain so it can process. So when I was considering how to even begin with the regions of the brain and what's sort of affected, I looked at breaking down this behavior into two sections, which would be the actual initial reading and then the imagining and the daydreaming, which is the second half. So you can see up here, obviously, the first thing you think of reading, you have to visually, read, and that is the occipital lobe, which you can see is in the back of the brain. And I found through my research that it sort of comprised of the entire brain, because not only did you have to have the memory and the sort of understanding that you see present in like the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe and all of the new brain, as well as the old brain, or like the cerebellum, and things that have to do with the just motor memory. Like if I'm imagining things, how am I imagining that these people move? How am I imagining things around me? And that sort of perception. So there are a lot of studies that showed that the fusiform gyrus, which is in the temporal lobe, it was really, really vital to recognizing faces and objects, which is something that I would definitely have to do if I was imagining what these characters looked like and was projecting them in the world around me. And the action of remembering, obviously, if I was reading these stories and storing them in my long-term memory, the hippocampus is a huge part in actually both having and retrieving those memories. But the obvious regions of the brain aren't the only thing that are very important. You also have to take a look at language comprehension and understanding. I had to be able to fully understand what I was reading in order to completely visualize it. So Wernicke's area is an area that facilitates language comprehension, and then Broca's area is an area that is found for language production. So whether I was telling these stories to strengthen the neural connections or whether I was reading it to fully understand, those are two important parts. And also the amygdala, which is a very small gland deep in the temporal lobe, and it has to do with emotion and emotional regulation. Obviously, children are very emotional, so everything that I kind of did with this behavior had a lot to do with emotional feedback. So looking at the perspective of memory on this behavior, I looked at it from, this is long-term memory. I still remember these stories now. Like I could still probably recall the majority of the books that I read when I was in middle school. And this was an explicit choice for me to read these books and internalize them. And it was also my explicit choice to remember them and project them the way that I did when the teachers took away the book. So that was a part of the declarative memory system. And also it included semantic encoding, which is sort of when you read something, your brain has to connect the dots between, oh, these aren't just sounds and letters, these are actual words that have meaning to them. So it had more of a deeper comprehension to them. There are a lot of other biological factors that go into this. I know earlier I talked about the secretions of the neurotransmitters and in the brain that kind of link everything together. And I would say that for me, I told you before that I was a creative child, and when I was younger, I was also diagnosed with ADHD. And there was a study that had shown that people who were very, very creative had a higher level of dopamine in their brain and bigger dopamine pathways, which is also kind of people who have ADHD crave dopamine. So I thought that that might be an example of why I participate in this behavior. And genes also are a huge part of creativity. My dad is also sort of a more creative thinker, and I've even gone in our attic before and seen like things that he's drawn or painted, and he's worked with different artists. So that made me think that maybe there are actually genetic components to the dopamine pathways that sort of can be passed down through generations. Emotional factors. I brought up earlier the point of the amygdala, but one interesting fact about the amygdala is that it can create emotional remembrance tags. So I would have read that book, I would have assigned an emotion to it, like this adventure story made me feel happy, and then obviously I would crave feeling that emotion again. So I would take it upon myself to recreate that visually so that I could experience the same emotion over again. And my brain would tell me and store that story specifically as a memory so I could recreate that feeling. And also it fosters emotional regulation in children to be able to kind of better understand their emotions. When you're a child and you have big emotions, you kind of need to go through things again to sort of learn how to deal with them. There are a lot of evolutionary and developmental implications. I think if I look at our ancestors from like 1,000 years ago, if I saw, another member of my clan or whatever getting injured because they ate a berry, I can imagine that if I were to also eat that berry, I would probably also hurt myself. So as a child who was just so dedicated to learning and who was just so interested in experiencing new things, I think that being able to take the characters in my stories and sort of put myself in their shoes actually had a really important evolutionary impact, because it made me sort of like, oh, this is how they reacted to things. Now I know how to react to things because they're someone I look up to. So for environmental influence, as I'm sure everyone else has experienced, sometimes in a home there can be tension. If there's arguing, it happens to everyone. And sometimes if that were to happen, I think that it might have been possible that it was a good escape for me if I needed to kind of, get into my book, or even to get away from the stresses of everyday life. I could start reading my book and start imagining, and then I wouldn't have to deal with the reality that I was currently in. And also when I was in school, focusing is something I struggled with. And also classes were not engaging to me. I was often felt like I was pretty understimulated in them. Like I felt like, oh, I know the material, so why do I have to pay attention anymore? So I felt like I should have been able to just, I wanted to stimulate my brain in a different way, which is why I sort of craved to create these scenarios. So social factors and motivations, I would often share these stories with my friends and sort of be always the one coming up with these crazy, ridiculous scenarios and oh, let's all pretend that we're this, or let's play out this story, or sort of role play entire books basically. And I'm sure they got very tired of it. But it actually led to me making a lot of friends. Even though I was younger, kids were just kind of intrigued when I would come out to them and tell them these crazy stories and tell them all the things that I had imagined. And so I think that that was definitely positive reinforcement of them realizing that it was a connection that they could make with me and that I was interesting. So that probably made me want to continue to participate that behavior to continue to foster friendships. It also made it so that I could apply learned experiences. I learned that this is how people act, and now I can act out these roles with other people that I met when I was younger. Thank you for listening, and here are my references. Any questions?
Thank you, Aaliyah. Any questions for Aaliyah? Oliver, if you'd like to jump up to the mic, thank you.
Okay, first of all, that was an amazing presentation.
Thank you.
So my question to you is, what made you want to dive into this topic of study for this?
I would say that when I was kind of like reflecting and trying to figure out what my weirdest behavior is, I felt like it would have been kind of not simple, but I was like, oh, I could go into like a physical behavior I did. But when I think of psychology, it kind of makes me think of the mind itself. And like, I found that in the beginning of my research, I didn't find a lot easily accessible on imagination in kids, which I thought was kind of interesting because I thought that'd be like a more widely researched topic, especially when it came to somebody who's like, I'm the type of person who can like picture something very clearly in their head. And there was a lot of like clashing heads and like not clear explanations on exactly how that happens. So it made me want to learn more about it.
Awesome.
I appreciate that your answer was more than Dr. Levy told me to. Other questions for Aaliyah? I'm wondering if you've ever transferred all this from inside your head to paper.
Yes, I actually do that all the time. Like well, I don't know if this is like, I used to like draw out my dreams, and I think that also the way that I visualize things, I think applies itself. Like I'm an artist, I paint and draw a lot, and it's like when I was younger, I never understood that like you could show me like a picture of something and I can just, it just transfers, and I never understood that other people couldn't do that. But yeah. Oh yeah, I would write them down too, because I feel like I would feel people that would need to know all of these detailed things, so I would share them like that. So yeah.
Thank you, Aaliyah. Okay, our next presentation is by Will Mason via video, but he will join us at the end for questions. Yes? Yes, awesome. All right, so Will's presentation is entitled My Weirdest Childhood Behavior, the Science of Selective Mutism. So let's see if we can make this work.
My name is Will Mason, and today I will be analyzing my weirdest childhood behaviors. In order to fully demonstrate a total examination of this behavior, I will be utilizing multiple perspectives and concepts within psychology. Pictured here is the table of contents outlining what I will be covering today. I will first begin with backstory, followed by a brief clinical definition before I delve further into the specific psychological aspects of my weird behavior. As I have previously stated, I would like to provide a backstory to my weird behavior. I will begin with the fact that aside from early medical issues due to a preterm birth, I was a typical child in terms of development. My weird behavior did not seem to emerge until I was around 5 years old and entering kindergarten. Upon entering kindergarten, it became apparent that I had an issue with communication. When I was in the classroom, I would go from a typical talkative child to extremely silent, to the point of concern. This behavior remained both around adults and my peers. Now, before I interpret this behavior through perspectives in psychology, I want to take a moment to provide the clinical definition of this behavior. The situational nonverbal behavior I exhibited as a child is indicative of selective mutism. Selective mutism is a largely misunderstood disorder, defined as an anxiety disorder characterized by a person's inability to speak and communicate effectively, but only in certain settings. Selective mutism is primarily diagnosed in childhood, but if left untreated, the symptoms can persist into adulthood. As a final note, it is important to clarify that selective mutism is not caused by trauma, abuse, or neglect, nor is it comparable to mutism resulting from frontal lobe damage to the brain. With the biological perspective, the basis of selective mutism is less specifically studied in comparison to anxiety disorders as a whole. However, the relation of selective mutism to other anxiety disorders is evident. In fact, approximately 90% of children with selective mutism have comorbid social anxiety disorder. This is important when considering the genetic basis of anxiety. For example, a 2017 genome-wide association study found that social anxiety disorder can have a heritable basis. A genome-wide association study scans markers around complete sets of DNA in order to find the genetic variations associated with a particular disease. In short, this means that I could have genetically inherited a disposition to anxiety. Moving on to the neurological perspective, I would like to consider the studied hypothesis that suggests children with selective mutism have a low threshold of excitability in the amygdala of their brains. The amygdala is located in the region of the brain associated with emotions, self-preservation, and learning and memory. When confronted with a fearful scenario, the amygdala receives signals of potential danger from the sympathetic nervous system and activates a series of reactions intended to help protect an individual from perceived danger. When putting my behavior alongside this context, the perceived danger would be an anxiety-inducing social setting, and in my case, that would be at school. Similarly to the connection with other anxiety disorders, I feel the need to bring up the link between selective mutism and developmental delays. A 2014 study found that very preterm children and/or children with low birth weights had a higher prevalence of speech delays. Furthermore, 20 to 30% of children with selective mutism have a speech and/or language abnormality. This is significant due to the fact that, as I have previously stated, I was born preterm at around 25 weeks, weighing 1 pound, 9 ounces. As a result, many of my developmental milestones were delayed. To what extent these delays impacted the severity of my selective mutism is uncertain, but the correlation between them is noteworthy. Let's move on to the behavioral perspective. I first want to begin by defining temperament, or the innate characteristics that infants are born with. These often remain consistent into adulthood. Children with selective mutism frequently have inhibited temperaments. Inhibited temperament, also known as behavioral inhibition, is characterized by fear and withdrawal from new situations and environments. This temperament style remains stable without improvement to a child's confidence and independence. In the same way, selectively mute behavior can be a result of negative reinforcement. The cycle of negatively reinforced behavior has been described as follows. Anxiety-provoking situation. Child is prompted to speak. Anxiety level increases. Child becomes anxious. Avoidance behavior. Child avoids speaking. Rescue behavior. Adult rescues child by removing expectation to speak, usually by answering for the child. Lastly, the anxiety level decreases as the child feels less anxious when rescued. Here is a chart describing the model I have previously stated. Lastly, I would like to consider the cognitive perspective. To begin, anxious behavior in children with selective mutism can be attributed to cognitive distortions. Irregular or irrational thought patterns known as cognitive distortions are common in children with anxiety. To close, I would like to thank you for listening to my analysis of my weirdest childhood behavior. Following will be a list of references I utilized. Any questions?
Great presentation. I just wanted to ask, what for you personally, what was the biggest hardship that you found overcoming this, like throughout your adult years?
I think it was just a lot of the intensive therapy that I had to go through. It definitely took a lot of trial and error in terms of figuring out therapy and medication treatment.
First off, I just want to say that it's really admirable for you to be open about your anxiety disorder. As someone who has an anxiety disorder, it's really hard to put that out here because I'm scared that it might discredit my reputation as an academic. Do you find that you have a genetic history in your family with anxiety disorders?
Definitely. Definitely.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Will, in your research, did you encounter information about the average age at which children tend to outgrow or shift in their communication with selective mutism?
A lot of the material is definitely focused on children. I had to do a little bit of digging to find information on adulthood. I would say it's usually young childhood, like 5 to 10, is where it's most widely understood.
Any other questions for Will? Okay, thank you so much. Okay, our next presenter is Veronica Himes, and Veronica is going to talk about her weirdest childhood behavior with her mom getting off the phone. Veronica. You can use the pointer of the mouse.
Which show?
This goes forward.
Okay. Okay, hi everyone. First off, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of background. My mom, dad, and my brother and I all lived in California. It was until the year of 2011 that my parents decided to get a divorce. At this year, I was like 7 or 8 years old, so I was fairly young. Due to the divorce, my dad decided that he and I were moving back out to Connecticut, but my mom stayed back in California. Due to my mom and I being so far apart, we would call on the phone every night before I went to bed. Most of the time, I would fall asleep while on the phone with her because while we were on the phone, she would sing me songs and just until I fell asleep. But then after a certain amount of time of me being asleep on the phone, my mom would end the call. But then I would wake up to make sure that she was still on the call. But because she hung up, I would start crying and having anxiety due to her leaving the call. First, I would like to talk about the biological perspective of anxiety. The brain has chemicals that are called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are what send messages back and forth to control how a person feels. When it comes to anxiety, the two most important neurotransmitters are serotonin and dopamine. When the serotonin and dopamine transmitters are distributed, it can cause feelings of anxiety and even depression. What is the purpose of serotonin and dopamine? Serotonin is a chemical that carries messages between nerve cells in the brain and throughout the body. The chemical messages tell the body how to work. Dopamine is a type of monoamine transmitter which acts as a chemical messenger and communicates messages between the nerve cells in the brain and the rest of the body. Next, I would like to talk about the cognitive perspective of anxiety. There are two factors that come into play when it comes to the cognitive perspective of anxiety. The two are loss of control and inability to make a coping response. Loss of control indicates a situation when there are unpredictable and uncontrollable events in a person's life that lead to anxiety and even depression. The inability to make a coping response indicates the inability to make an adaptive response to a threatening event, fact, or perception that there is no response available, which lead to anxiety. The next perspective I would like to talk about is the neurological.
There are three important parts of the brain that play a role in anxiety. The three are the limbic cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala, which are all a part of the limbic system. The limbic cortex combines the sensory, affective, and cognitive components of pain and processes information concerning the internal bodily state. The hippocampus has control over the hypothalamic stress response system and has a role in negative feedback for the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal. The amygdala is responsible for the expression of both fear and aggression, as well as it plays a role in the receiving of memories that are emotional and that involve fear. Lastly, I would like to talk about the environmental perspective. The environmental factor of anxiety is traumatic experiences like divorce, illness, death of a loved one, and/or a major event outside of the family. These events can cause the onset of anxiety, as well as anxiety can also be learned from other family members who are clearly stressed out or anxious. When I was 7 or 8 years old, when my parents got divorced, and when I moved away from my mom, that caused me to have anxiety because it was a traumatic experience. But because I was so young, I could have very well learned the anxious behavior because my mom and dad were probably very well anxious and stressed as well during that time, which I saw and maybe learned the behavior from as well. References.
Thank you, Veronica. Questions? How long did you, like over what period of time did you have these calls with your mom?
Oh, geez. It was probably from like 2011 to she moved back here in 2020. So it was a fairly long time.
Well, she's a committed mom.
Yeah.
Anything else for Veronica? All right, thank you so much. And our final presenter is Juliana Sterling, and she will be talking about burnout prevention in healthcare.
So good afternoon, my name is Juliana Sterling, and today my presentation will be on burnout prevention in healthcare. So what is burnout? Burnout could be thought of as a syndrome caused by chronic and long-term stress. Burnout can manifest in depersonalization due to severe amounts of stress, extreme exhaustion, and a decline in professionalism. There's not enough research to conclusively determine the totality of burnout in healthcare. However, the following data I'm about to present provides a glimpse into the severity of the issue. A survey conducted in Hawaii, which consisted of a total of 535 participants, found the percentage of healthcare workers that reported burnout to be between 39 and 66%, varying from country to country. Another study of 166 healthcare workers found that 27% reported job strain. Healthcare workers are constantly exposed to suffering and death, which causes emotional taxation in job stress. Job stress is defined as the physical and emotional responses that occur when the requirements of the job do not match the capabilities, resources, or needs of the worker. It was found that 71% of healthcare workers felt they did not have sufficient resources to provide the quality of care they would like to their patients. The survey also demonstrated that healthcare workers felt that burnout could be reduced if there was a more balanced staff-to-patient ratio. If there was better supervision of patients and staff, it would also improve working conditions and create a more beneficial work environment. In another study, researchers found that of 535 participants, 91% of staff reported to work more than 60 hours a week, as well as feeling that their workplace was understaffed. So once COVID-19 spread throughout healthcare facilities, healthcare workers were being relocated to other facilities. This relocation caused an increase in anxiety. Data has shown that 67% were at high risk of burnout. 20% had anxiety, and 11% had depression. Due to a dramatic increase in COVID-19 cases and a decrease in healthcare staff, healthcare workers were working between 55 and 60 hours a week. According to a survey of 2,500 doctors in Canada regarding medical safety gear, 42% expressed a concern about the lack of gear and fear of running out. 29% of doctors felt it was simply getting worse. They felt it affected their safety and the safety of their loved ones. The lack of PPE only amplified their fear and anxiety. The survey demonstrated that 96% of physicians were experiencing some level of anxiety. In previous pandemics and/or infectious disease outbreaks, it was found that they psychologically affect healthcare workers by causing post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic stress, anxiety, and depression. Historically, a contributing factor is excessive workload. Compared to previous pandemics, COVID-19 has had a more global and significant psychological impact. Chronic stress healthcare workers endure contributes to the degeneration of the body. This is manifested in certain malfunctions of the body, such as digestive issues, hypertension, insomnia, depression, and perpetual headaches. Prolonged exposure to stress can lead to anxiety, depression, burnout, and compassion fatigue. As mentioned, burnout in healthcare workers can manifest in depersonalization due to severe amounts of stress, extreme exhaustion, and a decline in professionalism. Depersonalization is known to cause healthcare workers to develop negative feelings towards the patients they are treating, and in turn causes them to view themselves negatively. A decline in professionalism can cause healthcare workers to make either minor or even fatal mistakes while they're treating a patient. Due to the shortage of staff, hospitals had newly graduated healthcare workers work night and weekend shifts with no doctor overseeing the unit, which essentially breached the safety of staff and patients. These newly graduated workers lacked proper qualifications to replace the workers that had quit. As a result of poorly supervised new workers, the mortality rate was 3 times higher in the patients treated in understaffed facilities with proper nurse-to-patient ratio. So, some preventative strategies of burnout. Team nursing is when a group of healthcare workers all care for a group of patients. 72% indicated that team nursing would further ensure the safety of patients, and 81% felt it would also ensure the safety of nurses. A study examined how nurse unions are essential in preparing healthcare workers for future natural disasters and/or pandemics by providing 2 4-hour training sessions. In these sessions, healthcare workers are educated on how to work more efficiently when caring for COVID-19 patients to minimize unnecessary close contact. Team nursing would also be responsible for recognizing and addressing signs of burnout in staff to avoid chronic anxiety or depression. A survey of participants who attended these 2 4-hour trainings demonstrated that 94% of those surveyed indicated the programs had a positive effect on their knowledge. The study also found that 68% indicated the program had a positive effect on their skill, 71% indicated the program had a positive effect on their attitude, and 78% indicated the program had a positive effect on their practice. So, some preventative strategies. Mindfulness is one way healthcare workers can avoid burnout, as it births self-awareness, self-reflection, and a sense of leadership. Practicing mindfulness can also improve sleep, anxiety, and depression, which strengthens their level of resilience. Resources such as apps or trainings also encourages mindfulness through self-care ideas such as yoga, journaling, or guided meditation. Massage therapy reduces the bodily and psychological effects of stress. A study was conducted utilizing 60 registered nurses and nurse managers. Half of the group received massage therapy while the other half did not. The bodily and psychological effects from stress gradually decreased in the group that was receiving massage therapy. Aromatherapy delivers more accelerated feelings of stress relief, as it has the potential to lower heart rate when healthcare workers inhale the lavender, thus lowering stress. The oil is directly absorbed into the skin, seeping into the bloodstream, which results in the more immediate feelings of stress relief. Although it seems as massage therapy and aromatherapy are being compared, both have been found to be effective. In conclusion, burnout is prevalent and has consequences for medical providers such as medical errors, anxiety, and depression. It also has consequences for patients such as a higher mortality rate. Preventative strategies should be implemented in all healthcare facilities to decrease the effects of burnout. The implications for this study are to implement preventative strategies, to ensure more resources for healthcare workers, and for further research on preventative strategies and solutions to be conducted. And here are my references. Thank you for your time. Any questions?
Thank you, Juliana. Questions? Yes, ma'am. Step right up.
I just had a question about the sources. Were most of these, because a lot of it was very statistics, are they self-report, observational, or any other kind of like how were these numbers measured?
As far as like where I found them?
So like the
Scholarly
citations,
articles.
the citations that you provided for the
Mhm.
numbers, I was wondering if that was out of like self-report or if it was something that they did as a kind of like a questionnaire or a test.
They were
or-
surveys.
It was mostly surveys. Okay. And it was kind of like open-ended because some of these numbers I was looking at, they're very much everywhere, but I also was like, I imagine these numbers are quite higher. And I'm not saying that that means that you have incorrect data. It's just kind of like, I have to keep that in consideration, especially with something like burnout.
Mhm.
Sometimes I think some people feel quite guilty or nervous to let other, especially people in their workplace, know that they're feeling that stress.
Yeah.
So that was just what I was kind of thinking and reflecting on as I saw them.
Yeah, I'm sure they can be higher.
And I don't think I had any other questions, but I
Okay.
was interested to read your resources and especially about mindfulness. That would be great to explore.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for Juliana? Maya?
I know way back when we started our honors program, you were interested in pursuing a health career. Given your research, are you still pursuing your education in nursing?
Yes.
Well, that's very admirable, and we need more nurses. So
Thank
that's
you.
awesome.
We do.
Thank you.
Good question. And you know, the importance of, I don't know if when you started out with this project, if you could fully appreciate how the importance of it has only grown over the
Mhm.
course of working on it,
Yeah.
given the pandemic.
Yeah.
Anything else for Juliana? All right, thank you so much. Okay, well, that concludes this year's academic convivium. I'm so pleased that you joined us today to learn from these amazing students. I'd like to give another round of applause to these students for this amazing work. I know so much work went into what you saw today. You saw the end product, but they worked so hard all the way through, and I just want you all to know that your hard work really did pay off. Before we wrap up, I just want to give a few thanks. Thank you, Mike Kavanaugh, for all the AV help. Thank you, Todd Levesque and Rich Lenosi for assistance with video and live stream. Thank you to Elena Sanchez, who was like in it for the long haul today and made the live stream possible. Thank you, Jill Flanagan, Emily Canto, Kim Hogan, Steve Minkler, and Corey Martell for all of your help in making today possible. So thank you. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you here next year, hopefully in person again. Thank you.